1 billion years ago represents the cosmetic difference between a Jigglypuff of today and a Screamtail of yesteryear. A billion years? Is that really true, or is that Pokédex entry just made up information, or perhaps paranormal propaganda? If that's really true, the oldest Pokemon that we know about before this were 300 million years old, which is like Kabutops and Genesec's ancestors, which might also be Kabutops. But 300 million years? That's a 700 million year difference between the existence of Kabutops and Screamtail. Here in the real world, we didn't even have animals back then. People didn't exist, most plants didn't exist. In fact, it was mostly just single-celled organisms floating around this rock. So can Screamtail, Jigglypuff's ancestry, really date back that far? To a billion years?
Well, maybe not. It seems the dex entries for the Paradox Pokemon like Screamtail are somewhat fanciful in nature. So perhaps they shouldn't be taken literally. But all the same, the timeline of Paldea and how it is connected to the larger Pokemon world is fascinating. So shall we journey together through time itself to cover the entire timeline of the Paldea region and how it connects to the other events of Pokemon history.
Sounds good, but we are going to have to ignore some of the inconsistencies in Scarlet and Violet, like the Pokemon Brute Bonnet, which has a pattern on it that looks like a modern-day Pokeball. This is a Pokemon from the ancient past, but Fungus has a Pokédex entry talking about how it inspired the look of the modern Pokeball, so they can't both possibly be true, can they? Yeah, good, an explainer video for that. I'm going to guess Wibbly Wobbly...
Wibbly Wobbly, timey-wimey stuff, yes.
Ah, yes, okay. Well, I'll leave that link at the top of the description. But for now, let's start with the first factual event stated in the games. Just a wee little bit on from a billion years ago with Screamtail, Mrs. Rifle, my favorite history teacher, gives us our first date on the timeline. 1 million years ago.
1 million years prior to the events of Scarlet and Violet was, according to Mrs. Rifle, the formation of the Great Crater of Paldea. History at this time is effectively unknown, and there is a lot of that aforementioned wibbly-wobbly timey-wimey stuff going on within the Great Crater, so we're taking this one with a pinch of knackly. Get it? But if that is true, then it was likely created by some kind of meteorite, or perhaps the as-yet unseen third legendary Pokemon, as, you know, people weren't exactly going around causing large explosions that create craters a million years ago. It just wasn't happening. In the rest of the Pokemon world at that time, yeah, not much happened in recorded history, though that's to be expected with such a distant past. It's around 20,000 years ago that we finally start seeing things pop up in recorded history. Things like Claydol being created by humans, and Eternatus first falling from the sky. Of course, many Pokemon did roam the world at the time, like Relicanth and the various fossils, but much of their DNA dates back hundreds of millions of years, so relatively speaking, the crater's formation happened basically last week in comparison to that.
Now, the next oldest date is quite a skip along the timeline, being 2,000 years ago, and this is the time that the Paldean Empire came into being. And yes, you heard me right, I said 2,000 years ago, not the common data of the Pokemon world over the last several generations of 3,000 years ago. We know that AZ's war happened 3,000 years ago, and so too did a number of other events, but the Paldean Empire specifically didn't exist then. We actually don't know much about the region's history before this point, but 2,000 years ago, the Paldean Empire and the Great Exploration began, and it lasted for a millennia, 1,000 years. So at this point in time, the Galarian, Unovan, and Kalosian empires are all up and running and warring and have started. But it's interesting to note that the Paldea region specifically is described to always be at war at this time. With old abandoned watchtowers and castles, ruins all over the region, it seems like this was a world at war with itself. Elsewhere in the Pokemon world 2,000 years ago was also the destruction of the home of the Draconids and the creation of Meteor Falls. The Draconids seem genuinely very absent from this game, which, as modern Pokemon games go, is quite odd. The Draconids tend to pop up absolutely everywhere, but they seem to have no connection to Paldea at all. It's believed that the Draconids may have become the original Celestica people who entered Old Hisui, and actually around the time they would have been settling in Hisui, the original Celestica people, is when the Paldean Empire fell. But from 2,000 to 1,200 years ago, the Paldean Empire was reigning strong.
Then, around 1,500 years ago, or during the Paldean Empire, somewhere during the reigns of the rulers, kings, queens, and emperors, the Pokemon Gimmighoul was said to be born in a chest. Though there is already a theory on this channel exploring how this may tie into the Quartet of Ruin and their appearance in the region, so we won't say too much about them here. Other than that, though, we know little about the events that happened during the Paldean Empire. Of course, the closer we get to modern day, the more records are being kept, and that makes sense. All over Paldea are ruined castles and watchtowers where Gimmighoul live, suggesting a region at war, which we've previously mentioned is the case. And during times of war, it's typical for bits of history to be lost, especially if all that knowledge is being kept in the buildings that are being destroyed. In other regions, wars had seemed to have largely stopped. And 1500 years ago, the universal language of the unknown was being put into place with the creation of the Tamboy ruins in the Sevi Islands. So while other nations were collaborating and expanding into language, communication, and other technologies, Paldean Empire was constantly in a state of division and war over whatever treasure lay in the Great Crater.
805 years ago, we get this event referred to in the history classes as Unification, the formation of Paldea, and this is when the school was built. The school is the oldest standing building in the region, and as a result, Mesagoza City is also likely the oldest standing city in the entire region. As we've mentioned, the watchtowers and the forts, it seems like those may have predated the school, but the school is the first time where people started to come together and collaborate, sharing knowledge. The school acts as a sort of giant library, but also exchange of knowledge for all the people within. This school isn't like any old Pokemon school. This building instead represents a point when the region stopped being at war with itself and started working together. The only thing to note that's happening around this time is to the north in the Kalos region, Yveltal or Xerneas are falling asleep or waking up depending on the version. This would represent a giant shift in the infinity energy in the world, so perhaps that is somehow responsible for the end of the wars of Paldea and the unification happening. And while at first it's not even clear that these games are happening alongside the Kalos games in some kind of mega evolution focused timeline, notes that we can find teach us that Roaring Moon looks like a phenomenon happening in another region, i.e. mega evolution, so clearly it does have a lot of Kalos connections.
200 years ago, an expedition team led by a man called Heath finally reached the depths of the crater. There, they discovered Paradox Pokemon, already thriving, as one even attacked them. So how long have they been there for? Since the crater was made? Since 1,000,000 years ago? Or was Heath's appearance in the depths of the crater somehow responsible for these Pokemon's presence? He did, after all, descend with Cyclizar, and when he returned, he wrote the Scarlet and Violet book depicting Miraidon and Koraidon on the cover. So, is it possible his Cyclizar transformed into one of those Pokemon? Or maybe the presence of his Pokemon somehow brought about Paradox forms? Yeah, we simply don't know. What we do know is what Heath found at the heart of the crater, a giant crystal treasure, seemingly the source of terrestrial energy, though at the time no Terra Pokemon had been discovered. There's also a paragraph that mentions how Heath blacked out and had a conversation with someone, or something. He awakes with scribbled down notes for what we now know to be the time machine. It's in his handwriting, and he recognizes it, though he has no memory of writing it at all. These notes would later be used by Sada and Turo to help construct said time machine. Whilst Heath's team are in the crater, they also dig up some metal slab with what looks like a sextant on it. A sextant is a tool, one used for traversal, so possibly more time machine instructions, perhaps left there by the Paldean Empire, or someone from the future sent back in time. When Heath returned to the surface, he also brought with him the Herba Mystica. However, before they had a chance to farm the ones that they planted on the surface, Pokemon had already been drawn to them and eaten them, becoming the first Titan Pokemon. Around this point in time across the rest of the Pokemon world, the main thing of note is that humans were finally settling in Hisui. You've probably even played this part of history yourself, involving a time traveler, or two. With all this mention of time travel, it makes you wonder, perhaps there is something going on in the Pokemon world making 200 years ago a place that attracts time travelers. It's worth noting as well that the Pokemon of Hisui were said to be more savage than those of other regions, and that's verified here, as not only did Heath travel with a partner Cyclizar, something that would be unusual in Hisui, but when a member of his team is attacked by the Great Tusk or Iron Tread's Pokemon, this is seen to be an unusual occurrence. Pokemon don't usually attack people.
We don't currently know what happened to Heath, but the last page in the Scarlet and Violet book mentions a third legendary Pokemon with a giant shell filled with hexagons. We may see similar patterns on the floor or on the ceilings of the Time Machine room, and while we know this Pokemon is responsible for terrestrial energy, it seems likely that this Pokemon is also responsible for the creation of time travel somehow. It is also mentioned as being seen by Churro and Sada, so maybe Heath was zapped back in time or into the future by this Pokemon, we just don't know. It's unknown if Heath was alive 140 years ago when the first terrestrial Pokemon emerged from the crater, but given he was already middle-aged / an older man at that time, it seems unlikely. So after he died, and by the time these terrestrial Pokemon were being discovered for the first time, he was being discredited and ridiculed for his wild assertions. 140 years ago, though, does point to something a little bit odd, because the only other thing happening in the Pokemon world at this time was the burning down of the 2 towers of the Johto regions around 150 years ago. And at first, this seems completely unrelated to the Paldea region. It would seem to have no connection to the Scarlet or Violet book. But interestingly enough, inside the Scarlet book, which was written 200 years ago, there's an image of a creature that seems to be a combination of Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. Pokemon that 200 years ago shouldn't have existed, because their origins lie in those towers being burnt down 150 years ago. So what's happening here? Is the Pokemon in the book real? Did Raikou, Entei, and Suicune look like this before the tower was burnt? Or is the person drawing this having some kind of premonition of the future as a result of the wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey powers of the creature that lives within the crater? Hopefully a future DLC can shed some light on this.
Explorers kept researching at Area Zero, and 87 years ago, research stations were built into the various layers. Understanding Area Zero itself has required generations of work. Of course, none of the characters we interact with in Scarlet and Violet ever actually worked in these stations when they were first built, and we don't really know anything about who would have operated them. I will say as well, this is kind of an odd date, and a weird one that's specifically pointed out. It's a bit of a dead spot in the Pokemon timeline, as nothing else really happens across the rest of the world. Not that we know of anyway. That is, until you realize that 87 years ago for Scarlet and Violet are not 87 years ago for, say, Red and Blue. Generally speaking, the games have fallen along the same timeline as their release, with Scarlet and Violet being set around the Pokemon world's equivalent of 2022. This means 87 years ago for Scarlet and Violet is actually around 65 years for Red and Blue. This, of course, would change the previous dates we've discussed, but when you go over 100 years, people start to generalize. People will say this thing happened 500 years ago, even when they could actually mean 520. It's all a bit vague. So if we take that to be the case, what happened 65 to 87 years ago in the Pokemon world? It's still not a whole lot, actually. Some of Pokemon's oldest characters, like Oak, Drayden, Drake, Agatha, and Kurt, were all being born around that time. So I guess that's something.
And now we enter the true recent history. We know that Arven was born around 16 years ago, and if you place that alongside my timeline from the My Complete Timeline video, that would be just about sometime before Generation 5 is happening. At this point, Sada and Churro are working in the research stations together and building the time machine. According to the notes, time travel was created around this point, and the first Paradox Pokemon they successfully brought through was Koraidon and Miraidon. They tried to bring this Pokemon to the surface, but when people saw it attack a wild Pokemon, they returned it to Area Zero. Arven stopped seeing his parents around then, instead going to study at the school. Around 6 years later, or 10 years ago, they would master the creation of the Terra Orb, with Clavel working on this project alongside Sada and Churro. So this is about when Black and White are actually starting. This would have been around when Arven was 5 or 6, and we don't have a specific date, but we do have this photo of Arven and... sorry, I'm just reading my script here. Obviously, the Pokemon is Mastiff, but I have Master Chief written here. So this is Arven and Master Chief are in this photo, and then he went and gave the Covenant back their bomb. Anyway, he looks to be around 5 or 6 years old in this photo, and one of his parents, Sada or Churro, depending on the version, would leave to spend more time with him, and using modern technologies the professor left behind, Sada or Churro, would create an AI companion to help them. Interestingly enough, in Black and White 2, which is about when this would be timed, the Pokemon World Tournament is happening, which features trainers including the mob boss Giovanni from across the Pokemon world, all of them de-aged from where they should be in the timeline. So I wonder if this can now be explained as the existence of more AI, as we know the technology exists around that time.
Sometime around this point, Sada and Churro have raised Arven in the crater, with either Miraidon or Koraidon. So that's how Arven knows the Pokemon. However, depending on the game you play, because of either Sada or Churro's obsession with Paradox Pokemon, the other parent had to take Arven away from it all. As for Clavel, at this time he doesn't seem to be involved anymore. So instead, Sada and Scarlet, and Turo and Violet, and their AI companion continue to pull Paradox Pokemon in from the past or the future. Now, I find it interesting that there had been no mention of Paradox Pokemon for about 200 years at this point. Not since their discovery by Heath's team, but we know that Sada and Turo are sending back a multitude of Master Balls, possibly to scoop up the very Pokemon that Heath's team found, and perhaps that's why they disappeared for so long, only popping up again 10 years ago once they were being re-released into the crater. And let's not forget that singular Great Tusk, or Iron Treads, that did manage to make it to the surface. If you're wondering how Sada and Turo got their hands on so many Master Balls, then you need to understand that typically Master Balls are given to researchers of high standing, and not in plentiful amounts. But in Paldea, this works slightly differently. You can get given Master Balls for entering the Academy's Hall of Fame by showing excellence, which Sada and Turo both did. Around this point in time, they also pull through another Miraidon or Koraidon and release an army of Paradox Pokemon, which then reproduce in the crater. All these past and future Pokemon, though, are not a good recipe, and this is where the incident at Research Station 4 happened. We're told by the AI companion of the professor that the real-life professor had already died in an incident that happened at Research Station 4. If we look at Research Station 4, we can see crystals jutting out of the ground. We're also told that the professor tried to contain the power of a Pokemon. That Pokemon is never revealed to us exactly what it is. Given the crystals we see, though, I believe it's something to do with the third legendary. You may think that's it, that we're up to date, but Scarlet and Violet are about the past and the future, so there's one final chapter to tell. What happens to Sada and Turo at the end of the game?
Well, we know that Sada's AI goes into the past and Turo's AI went into the future, and this is just speculation this bit, but I believe the opposite character did the same thing depending on the version you're playing. Allow me to explain. In Pokemon Scarlet, we never meet Turo. I suspect, though, that after helping to raise Arven, in Scarlet version, Turo uses the time machine, following either natural curiosity to see the future, or perhaps looking to undo the incident at Research Station 4 to go into the future to see if he could find anything that could help out that he could send back in time later on. Meanwhile, in Violet, I believe that after raising Arven, Sada goes back in time, again out of natural curiosity, or to prevent this disaster in Area Zero from even happening. This is why we don't see Sada and Turo, despite the fact that they're mentioned in Violet or Scarlet, respectively. And this speculation isn't based on nothing. It's all to do with this metal plate that was dug up by Heath's team. They can't date it. They say maybe it dates back to the Paldean Empire, but it's written on a metal that seems to be unknown to science of the time, science of 200 years ago. I believe the metal is from the future, wherever Turo went, but the engraving is written by Sada in the past, and that's where it was buried. This is a piece of communication between the two professors from across time. Again, the image on here is the sextant, which is about traversing, so perhaps this is the instructions for time travel and how to master time travel. This is information that they're sending back and forth to each other in the past, future, and present, so that they're able to read it and create the time machine. While at the end of the game, they look to try and shut down the time machine, they also have to create it. For one simple reason, and it's kind of beautiful. It's for Arven. Because as far as we know, Sada and Turo came together because they were working on the time machine. It's possible that if they weren't ever working on the time machine, Arven would never have existed. So while it's important for them to get the time machine shut down, it's also important to them that it must be made in the first place. Because if it wasn't, if they instead decided to send information back in time to stop the time machine from ever existing, Arven may never exist as well, and they can't have that. And so that's what I believe that Turo is doing in the future. There is one more date super close to modern day, which is about a year and a half ago, to do with the Team Stars story, which according to the timeline would be just after Sword and Shield happened and the DLC happened. I don't really have anything here to say though. Team Stars seems infinitely less impressive than the metal plates and notes being sent from the future back in time to guarantee their own creation.
Well, they did make the entire school change their staff. No small feat. And interestingly, Penny was sent home to the Galar region right after Sword and Shield, so it's possible she could be somewhere among the NPCs in the Crown Tundra, or somewhere on the mainland. Let's keep a lookout for that Easter egg. But in terms of the instructions for time travel, that would make the writing a bootstrap paradox. It exists because it was sent from the future to the past, but only goes to the future because it existed in the past and was read in the present and was taken to the future. This may also, in fact, be how the creation of Pokeballs work, given we see Master Balls sent through the time machine, and sure enough, Among Us of the ancient past looks like a Pokeball, but for more on that thought, you're gonna have to go over to the video on my channel.
Thank you. Dinosaurs and robots. The idea of past and future Pokemon stretches all the way back to the days of Generation 1, in which Porygon and Kabuto and Omanyte were given life in the exact same building on Cinnabar Island. But now this idea doesn't belong to just a few special Pokemon. No, instead there are the Paradox Pokemon, a whole roster of Pokemon that look as if they are from the past and the future, filling up the crater at the heart of the Paldea region, known as Area Zero. Their biology and what we know about them suggests that they could be as old as 1 billion years, or from 1 billion years in the future. They change what we know about the history of the Pokemon world, if what we know about them is to be believed. Because I did a number of videos on this topic last year, so did a whole bunch of other YouTubers, and people talked about it on Twitter and on Discord. No matter where you go, when you talk about Paradox Pokemon, the same comment comes up time and time again. Yeah, but the history about them can't be factual because they're not really real. No, Toby, don't you know that these Pokemon were created by the imagination of Professor Sada and Professor Shiro? Except, hang on a second. No, look, it says it right here. Heath's team even took photographs in the Scarlet and Violet book. You can literally see these Pokemon existed 200 years ago. So how could they be created by the imagination of today? Maybe it's something to do with the time machine? Is the time machine a time machine or some kind of imagination dream machine? When taking on this topic, I thought it was going to be really straightforward, just to make a pros and cons list, a real or fake list. I thought this would be no big deal at all. But it turns out that's just the A plot of this video, because when I jumped in a call with fellow Pokemon theorist and YouTuber SB Juju, we found out that no, there is a whole big missing puzzle piece that tells the entire story and explains exactly where Paradox Pokemon come from, and it's to do with the 3rd disc legendary Pokemon, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
Hey Toby, in fact, we are so confident in our assessment that we're even willing to say spoiler warnings here for the DLC, because it connects in so well with everything laid out to us in this and other Pokemon games. I would say we are 100% sure that at least 90% of this is correct. Are you ready, Toby?
Oh, I'm ready. So I thought the easiest way to tackle the question on the thumbnail was to make a simple sort of pros and cons list, a real or fake list, dividing up the evidence that suggests that these Pokemon really are truly biological and have ancestry in the Pokemon world, or whether they're some kind of imaginary being. So let's start with the evidence that suggests these Pokemon are real, because at first it seems so simple. In the game, Sada and Chiro are working on a time machine, a technology that we know exists in the world of Pokemon. Bill from Generation 2 has his time capsule trade machine, and a character in Generation 5 who gives you the cell battery is eager to make a time machine. And actually, based on how the Pokemon timeline lines up, Sada and Chiro successfully completed theirs around the same time that this Gen 5 dialogue happened, so I wonder if there could be a connection there. This happening 10 years before the events of Scarlet and Violet. They do it. They create a time machine, and by sending Master Balls through, they're able to catch Pokemon that appear to be of the ancient past and far future. The game calls it a time machine, they call it a time machine, their AI counterparts call it a time machine, and all of the research notes across both labs suggest that yes, they are in fact making a time machine, and of course the Pokemon that return to them from the past and future, if they really are the past and future, are exactly what you'd expect for a past and future set of Pokemon.
Pro or real number 2. You know by now Roaring Moon looks like Mega Salamence. And if you've seen the video on Lumio's post channel, you'll know that Mega Aerodactyl refers to the fact that it is the closest to what Aerodactyl would have looked like, meaning the forms of Mega Pokemon really represent what Pokemon may have looked like in the past. With fossil Pokemon, it's a bit different due to the resurrection machine guaranteeing the rock type, and so changing the form a little bit due to the changing of the genetic structure of the Pokemon. However, Mega Salamence and Roaring Moon are stated in the games to look like each other. Furthermore, the Mega Evolution phenomenon uses Infinity Energy, also known as Primal Energy in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, which is also a term used by Arven in the Great Crater. These Pokemon match the biology of their ancestors infused with ancient energy, clearly shown by both Mega Salamence and Mega Aerodactyl.
But I think the biggest bit of evidence and the most definitive that these Pokemon really are biological creatures from the ancient past, at least, is that records of them seem to go back at least 200 years ago, according to the records of Heath, from where there are photographs, and maybe even 2,000 years ago. Because, according to Miss Rifle, back when Paldea was an empire, people sought out the treasure at the heart of the Paldea region in the Great Crater, but none returned. Now, possibly that's just because they didn't have the right climbing equipment, or what seems more likely is that they were attacked by these savage monster versions of Pokemon that are barely even considered to be Pokemon. We know that when Heath's team descended 200 years ago, his team was attacked by these Pokemon as well, which is unusual for the time in Paldea, because where in Hisui, Pokemon are thought to be a little bit more savage, here in Paldea, Heath and his team worked alongside Pokemon. Just take a look at Heath with his Cyclizar. So with all of this evidence there, why would anyone think that these Pokemon are imaginary?
While there is basis for this in the game, this actually started as a result of leaks. Riddler Koo on Twitter, a well-known leaker, mentioned that these Pokemon are somehow imaginary, and we do know for a fact that there are imaginary Pokemon in the games. They are in the Scarlet and Violet book. Some kind of past fused version of Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, and some kind of future version of Virizion, Cobalion, and Terrakion. So far, we don't know for sure these are actually Paradox Pokemon, and probably neither did Koo. But given Iron Valiant also appears to be a future fusion of both Gallade and Gardevoir, it seems like a safe assumption to make, as fusions are clearly shown to exist in Area Zero. If the information Koo had at the time of leaking was the same as the info we have now in-game, then it's possible Koo is just theorizing that the fusion Pokemon are the same as Paradox Pokemon. But because he's known as an accurate-ish leaker, it's now accepted as fact. One way or another, the idea that Paradox Pokemon are imagined reached into public discourse before the games even came out, meaning people read the clues for them being imaginary and ignored the elements that suggest they are real on their first playthrough. This doesn't mean they're wrong, of course, just that there is a certain observational bias going into the game. So what are the pros for Paradox Pokemon being imaginary?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the descriptions of these Pokemon in-game are ridiculous, talking about a billion years in the past, or the future, or the age of dinosaurs. I mean, they're a little less ridiculous in Scarlet version, or at least for the prehistoric Pokemon. In Scarlet version, the information about these prehistoric Pokemon are described as factual notations from a research journal. It's the future Paradox Pokemon that are part of a dubious scientific magazine. Of course, in Violet version, this is flipped, and those future Pokemon are thought of as being very real, part of a research journal, and the past Pokemon from some kind of supernatural magazine. In both cases, the magazine being talked about, however, is the Occulture magazine. Occulture coming from the word occult and culture, and magazine coming from magazine. Occult coming from strange, supernatural, and phenomena, so it fits these Pokemon really well. Now, it would seem that there is a magazine issue covering each of the Paradox Pokemon, both past and future, that exists in both games. This is because in Scarlet version, for example, the notes for the prehistoric Pokemon can be found all throughout the school, the Poké Lab, and of course, the research stations. In Violet, this flips over to the future Pokemon, but in Scarlet version, the Pokédex entries for the future Paradox Pokemon are the same as the magazine entries from Violet version, and vice versa, which means there is an issue on all of these past and future Pokemon. The only different description of these Pokemon that exists in the game, as I mentioned earlier, is that in Scarlet version, those prehistoric Pokemon are mentioned in the Pokédex to be much more factual, annotations from a real research journal talking about the Scarlet book, and in Violet version, it's the same thing for the Violet book and the future Pokemon. But when the Scarlet and Violet book first came out, people did not believe the findings that were in there. They didn't believe the writings of Heath at all, and I believe that a local magazine in Paldea took those books and said, hey, bad scientific finding, but great idea for a weekly Monster of the Week series, or Monster of the Month. In Violet version, for example, they would have taken all of those future Pokemon and done a different monthly issue on each of them, and then once they had run out of ideas, they started drawing out the past Pokemon to keep that series going. With this happening ever since the publication began sometime after Heath returned to the surface, Sada and Churro grew up on these stories, and in fact, so did the whole of the Paldea region. It entered the public consciousness as being the stuff of fantasy.
Sada and Turo dreamed of all this too, wanting to build a time machine to meet the Pokemon they read about as children in the Scarlet or Violet book. But it was more for them. It was an obsession. I mean, it took over their entire personality after reading the book, which is why Sada is dressed to look so archaic even in modern times. However, when speaking to Arvin after the game, he mentions the fact that the Paradox Pokemon existing before his parents' time machine doesn't make sense, and hints that his own mother made her obsession a reality. So the talk of these Pokemon being fantastical or being imagined isn't out of the game subplot. It is in fact strongly hinted at in-game by a main character. Additionally, on one of my replays of the game, I noticed in Clavel's office the fossilized footprint of a Cyclizar. However, it doesn't look like a normal Cyclizar. It looks much larger than what we would normally see. This suggests that ancient Cyclizar used to roam around Paldea, and if that is the case, then how could Koraidon realistically exist? Some may be thinking, how do we know that is a Cyclizar print and not Koraidon's? Well, if you study the feet of both Pokemon, you weirdo, you will see Koraidon has a much different foot than the fossil print, being four-toed and even webbed. So it all but guarantees that this print definitely belonged to a Cyclizar.
Another piece of evidence for all of these Pokemon being created or imaginary somehow is that all of them have the same ability, and while that shouldn't at first seem totally weird, after all, Pokemon of different species have the same ability, it's every single one of them. No matter how diverse they are, they all have the exact same ability. It could be something to do with the environment of Area Zero, but it just seems really unlikely that such a diverse array of life would all have the same ability, and it all seems tied to the abilities of Koraidon and Miraidon that seem to power this up. On top of that, Sada and Churro have created the power boosting item that boosts the power of their ability. As if Sada and Churro alone understand the biology of these Pokemon a little bit better than anyone else. On top of that, there is one other thing. This is a hard one to notice, but if you look at the version exclusive list of Pokemon, it seems that Fluttermane cannot live in a world where it will one day evolve into Mischievous, because Mischievous is a version exclusive Pokemon that doesn't exist in Scarlet version, only in Violet. The same is true for, say, Iron Jugulus. How could a Hydreigon have evolved eventually over time into Iron Jugulus if Hydreigon doesn't live in the world of Pokemon Violet, it only lives in the world of Pokemon Scarlet? This is also true for Tyranitar and Iron Thorns and Salamence and Roaring Moon. And the final big bit of evidence that feels like a nail in the coffin that these Pokemon are absolutely imagined is when you look to the Scarlet and Violet book, you see these two creatures, for which we don't have names yet. In Scarlet version, it's the combination of Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, which I will call the legendary beast for now, and Virizion, Cobalion, and Terrakion, the Swords of Justice, that I'll call the legendary future sword for now. And these Pokemon are directly stated as they've been drawn to be imaginary. So if these Pokemon are also Paradox Pokemon, which we don't know for a fact yet, but if they are Paradox Pokemon, then that would stand to reason that all of the other Paradox Pokemon are also somehow the creations of the imagination. At this point in the video, I was just going to leave the pros and cons list, the fake or real list, up on screen for you to make up your own mind in the comments down below, seeing as there seems to be strong evidence both ways, and I initially wasn't sure about how these bits of evidence could fit together to tell the same story. But like I say, this is just the A-plot. And when we uncovered what we're going to talk about next, it changed everything and brought these bits of evidence together to make one cohesive story that explains everything. What's coming in the future flipped everything on its head. Epsy, why don't you explain?
While on call and discussing these pros and cons, we found that we couldn't quite mesh them together into one cohesive story. Something was missing. That something is the third legendary, the disc Pokemon spoken of on the final page of the Scarlet and Violet book. This Pokemon has been met by at least two people, technically three, Heath and Sada and Turo. They are the only ones with records of the Pokemon, Sada and Turo 10 years ago when the time machine was finished and when they brought through Miraidon or Koraidon, and Heath 200 years ago when he and Cyclizar— wait, Heath is Cyclizar? Scarlet and Violet book. They're covers. This is it. This makes sense. This is how it all comes together. Okay, it's time. Let's take it from the top. Allow us to run through the story here beat by beat, and we have it all explained. The Pokemon are both real and imaginary, not ancestors or descendants to modern Pokemon though, but Sada and Turo didn't make them and neither did Heath. Heath just shows us how they are made. Okay, are you ready? Let's get into it. Take it away, Toby.
3,000 years ago in Pokemon canon, there was a war unlike any other. Mentions to this war and its ripple effects can be seen all across the recent generations of Pokemon. You've heard it all before, from Melmetal disappearing 3,000 years ago after turning giant, to Eternatus being brought down from the sky and causing the darkest day. Meteorites fell down on the Hoenn region 3,000 years ago, and they've continued to fall down every 1,000 years since then. And of course, this was all probably caused and the result of the war. AZ's war 3,000 years ago against his brother, who wanted the Kalos region for himself. We don't know whether he was a rival king of Kalos or the king of another region going to war, but this war was huge, and what was created after AZ's Floette passed away was the ultimate weapon. Using the power of Xerneas and Yveltal, the life and death trio, which also comprises of Zygarde, and that'll become relevant in a moment, he used this device to give life back to AZ's Floette, and then used the weapon to end the war completely. One shot fired up into the sky, came back down onto the earth, and ended the war full stop. This blast must have been powerful enough, I'm sure, to create Area Zero.
Mrs. Ryfort says the crater was 1 million years old. However, this seems to be a guess or over-exaggeration for flair, or even possibly a lie to hide something bigger. Plus, dating the crater may be difficult due to the timey-wimey nature of it. Additionally, there are far too many Kalos connections in this game, which I'm sure Toby will talk about in a future video. It stands to reason though this would be the impact point that ended the war. Paldea as a region is relatively sparsely populated, with communities separated by vast open land, unlike any other region to date in Pokemon. I mean, there are a few ruins of castles, forts, and watchtowers from a time before these cities, but the oldest intact building still standing is only 800 years old. So what gives? Well, we believe that the king of Paldea, potentially AZ's brother, had a partner Pokemon, and this partner Pokemon was this third legendary wearing a crown upon its head. It definitely gives an aura of royalty with the cloak and crown shown in the art, and definitely ties into Zygarde with its snake-like head and hexagonal patterns or crystals. You can clearly see the connections to Zygarde, and given Zygarde is the master of the Life and Death trio, which connects to the ultimate weapon fired upon, likely, Paldea, I suspect this Pokemon and Zygarde are somehow cross-generational counterparts, or even crazier, brothers like AZ and his brother at war in the Paldea region. AZ ended the war by blasting the life force of Pokemon in the air and back down on Paldea, where the impact landed and, as you all likely know by now, created Ground Zero in Paldea. Ground Zero is described as being the explosion or impact site of a meteor or detonation. This and AZ are where Area Zero gets its name, and this devastated the once centralized city of Paldea, blasting the region back to the Stone Age and ending the war. A blast so powerful it may well have blasted this third legend into another reality or dimension, not too dissimilar from opening an Ultra Wormhole like we see in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, or a regular wormhole like we see in ORAS, both of which are manipulated by this very energy. So the blast did so much damage to the third legendary and the point of impact that it created a portal or wormhole to another point in space and time.
It's at this point that the story of modern Paldea truly starts. There's no history of Paldea before 2,000 years ago, and that's because after being absolutely obliterated with very few people and relics surviving, it took 1,000 years before Paldea could even re-establish itself into what it would call an empire. And all the while, there was something down in the crater, some kind of drive calling people to seek out the treasure within. Promises of treasure at the heart of the Great Crater, or perhaps even a paradise referenced by Sada and Churro in their AI form. Anyway, at this point, the Empire wasn't much of an empire. Instead, it was a group of different factions with different rulers and emperors who fought against each other, all of them going for the treasure at the heart of the Great Crater, and no one returning. 800 years ago, they finally decided that if they were going to get down and get the treasure at the heart of the crater, they were going to have to unify, and so an event called Unification happened. This is when the school was built, and under the banner of education and learning, not warring, they were able to establish what would become the modern-day Paldean region. But even with this vast sharing of knowledge in the school, it would still take 600 years before Heath and his team would finally descend into the crater and have a successful expedition. When Heath and his team descended, they were attacked by a Pokemon that seemed monstrous, but this was very unusual in this region. We know that 200 years ago, this was normal in other areas like Hisui, as I mentioned earlier, where Pokemon are described to be more savage, but here in Paldea, people and Pokemon were already working together side by side. Heath had his Cyclizar, and much of his team had Pokemon as well, so these Pokemon that were attacking them were unlike any others, and they were documented as such. Heath still continued his descent, and he was given all sorts of strange revelations. He had a conversation with someone and ended up with notes of his own writing that he didn't remember making. A metal tablet was found made of a metal that was beyond modern science, with inscriptions that don't quite make sense. And his sketch artist, inspired by the creatures that they found down there, imagined Pokemon that wouldn't even exist yet. This combination of Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, according to the creation story we know from the Burnt Tower and Johto, wouldn't happen for another 50 years. In the final pages of the Scarlet and Violet book, though, we see a location that is unfamiliar to us. We can't visit this today, these big crystals. I believe that in the secret area of Area Zero, Heath made contact. Not physically with this disc legendary Pokemon that appears on the final page, but instead he was able to commune with it. He had followed its voice, the voice that had been echoing out through the Great Crater to all the people of Paldea. Come and find me, come to the Great Crater. And he describes it to his sketch artist, and he describes seeing it in a space that is definitely not Earth. And at this point, this Pokemon demonstrates its power by transforming Heath's Cyclizar, or perhaps duplicating Heath's Cyclizar, and creating for the first time Koraidon on Miraidon. Heath would put these Pokemon on the cover of his Scarlet and Violet book, and when he returned to the surface, he expected to blow the minds of the Paldean people with his findings. but its findings were ridiculed. And after doing the rounds, it was decided that this was the work of fantasy, not the work of real scientists, and a culture magazine picked it up and started doing issues on the creatures that were found within the crater. These creatures entered the public consciousness, but sure enough, this is the very thing that would make those Pokemon become real.
Sada and Turo now believed in the Paradox Pokemon and made their way into the crater to do their research, and 10 years ago completed both the Terra Orb and the Time Machine. They of course encountered Paradox Pokemon down there, but once the Time Machine was made, they brought through more, released them, and even brought through the previously made Koraidon or Miraidon to live in the present. Of course, at the end of the game, after you beat Sada or Turo, AI Sada goes to live in the past and AI Turo to the future. But even in their opposite version games, Sada or Turo is missing, but it seems they likely traveled to the past for Sada, and in Scarlet version, the non-AI Turo goes to the future, as it says they left long ago and left Arven with only one parent. This ensures there is both at least one version of both Sada in the past and Turo in the future. AI or real, both times have one of Arven's parents. With this occurrence, Turo could go to the future and send the plate with metal from science beyond our understanding back in time with the engraving on it, that is the instructions for the time machine in the first place, and Sada in the past would bury it at Area 0 for future Heath to find. These past Sada and future Turos in both timelines could very well be who is sending back their captured Pokemon into the time machine to make the machine work like the professors wanted. There is also the fact that besides just sending Pokemon to present Sada and Turo, both professors would use the time machine to send Pokemon into the past, once again making these Pokemon for Heath to find in the crater to photograph and sketch and make the Scarlet and Violet book. You see, those dreams of meeting Paradox Pokemon are after all what has got them working on the Time Machine project, and of course, that meant they'd get together and Arven would be born. In order to ensure that this happened, these Paradox Pokemon needed to exist to get Heath involved and create that interest in their present day selves. But the initial Paradox Pokemon, where did they come from? That's why it's a paradox, just like Paradox Pokemon. It is a Bootstrap paradox. They have no origin point, or their origin is because of a god in the machine, if you will, which is the third legendary Pokemon taking the imagination of Sada, Turo, Heath, and the collective consciousness of the people of Paldea to create these Pokemon. This third legendary sees the wishes or dreams of the Paldean people and can create things to achieve that, including making Paradox Pokemon. Once the initial Paradox Pokemon is created at any point in the timeline, boom! The paradox occurs and is a never-ending circle. Not to mention that a king Pokemon that can see into the future isn't odd or rare either. It's one of the many references the Crown Tundra makes to this generation with Calyrex, a legendary Pokemon king that can see through time. All this said, the first Paradox Pokemon in the crater appeared either by way of Sada and Turo sending them back in time, or created at the time of impact by the third legendary, as it was hit with immense infinity energy. This creation of the Paradox Pokemon by the legendary due to the wishes of people like Sada and Turo, and then the fact that these Pokemon are sent to the past by Sada and Turo to make themselves obsessed with them in the future so they can wish them to be true, so the third legendary creates them, is a never-ending loop. It's a true paradox, don't you see it? This is why these Pokemon are Paradox Pokemon, created by the all-powerful third legendary with a plan.
So the question then becomes, what does this Pokemon want? Why? Why is it doing what it's doing? Why has it been trying to get people to enter the Great Crater? Why did it want Heath to go down there? And why did it want Sada and Turo to create a time machine? Well, it didn't. But in creating the time machine, Sada and Turo also achieve something else. They create the Terra Orb. It seems to me that this legendary Pokemon is stuck in a reality outside of ours as a result of being struck by the ultimate weapon 3,000 years ago. It took 1,000 years for the Paldean Empire to eventually reform. It took a longer time for a successful expedition, and then with those stories it would inspire Sada and Turo to eventually pursue the time machine, and of course, the Terra Orb. It's looking for a way back into reality, and I believe the Terra Crystals and Terra Pokemon battles are its way of doing so. Because look closely at Terra Pokemon battling. All of the Pokemon, when they terastallize, have hexagons on their head with eyes, which, by the way, are not too dissimilar from the Zygarde cells that make up Zygarde, another connection between these two Pokemon. Including, of course, the hexagonal patterns that appear all over them, the snake-like face that they can both have, and the crowns that can appear on both of their heads. I believe that they were brother Pokemon at war at some point. For this disc legendary Pokemon, it's using the crowns, it's using the crystals to observe the Pokemon world. and those observations are represented in the Terra Crowns themselves that represent humanity over the last couple thousand years. Axes, boxing gloves, temples, the earth as seen from above, light bulbs. All of these very unnatural things that appear on the Pokemon's head are because they're the observations of this disc legendary Pokemon who is looking and watching the earth, hoping to find a way back into reality. Perhaps enough Terra battles will create enough Terra energy for it to reopen a wormhole and come back to Area 0. By the way, given the similarities between Zygarde and this disc Pokemon, it also reminds me of the similarities between Zygarde and Guzzlord. I wonder if Guzzlord is some other version of this Pokemon blasted through to a different reality, to Ultra Space. Anyway, whatever the case, this disc Pokemon wanted Heath as part of its plan because it needed Heath to inspire the Paldean people to think about these mystical paradox Pokemon. This, of course, would inspire Sada and Churro, who would then pursue those Pokemon and pursue the Time Machine. And in doing so, they would put the power of Terastallization into the hands of Pokemon trainers everywhere so it could increase its own presence in the region. But this means that its plan isn't yet finished, and I believe that's what we'll see in potential future DLC. We'll see the imaginations of those beasts and the swords of justice. We'll see them as the next part of its plan. Because as much as it needed Heath to go down there to talk about the Paradox Pokemon to inspire the Paldean people, it also needed Heath's sketch artist to go down there, who would create these Pokemon for some other region. And all of that ties into exactly what dimension this Pokemon has been residing in. SP?
The unknown dimension has too many connections to be a pure coincidence in our opinion. In fact, the third Pokemon movie features a book with strange depictions of legendary Pokemon thought to not be real. The unknown themselves could even function as seeing eyes for a larger Pokemon or ruler, which is hinted at in many theories such as Unknown being the 1,000 arms of Arceus. And like Toby said, it seems we get another taste of that with these Terra Orbs. Crystals, of course, are another big relational point between the third legendary of Paldea and the Unknown. Everyone that has seen the third Pokemon movie knows that Unknown bring imagination and dreams to reality through crystals like they do for Molly Hale. They are even able to bend reality to the point of creating legendaries and boosting the power of their created Pokemon. Much like how the crystals used by the third legendary of Paldea can change factors of a Pokemon like Terastallization, changing a Pokemon's base typing at will. And of course, not to mention all the other crystals found around Paldea. And of course, Suicune has a tie-in to crystal power as well. First mentioned in Pokemon Crystal, where a sage mentions Suicune's giant crystal on its head is thought to have a special connection to the unknown. Speaking of Suicune though, and its new form we will likely see soon, it's thought that the legendary beasts were created by Ho-Oh 150 years ago after the towers of Johto burnt down. But this means they came around 50 years after Area Zero sketch artists drew this Pokemon. Well, it seems like much how our disc legendary can tap into the minds of people to create Pokemon, so too can Ho-Oh, and most importantly, the unknown in Johto. What the unknown or Ho-Oh saw though was the people's different interpretations of a creature from a book they had recently read that was thought to be fiction across the entire world, the Scarlet and Violet book. We know it was likely making its way around the world at this time because in Pokemon Legends Arceus, Kogita has a book in her tent which seems to be a totally unique model of one very violet-looking book. Not definitive evidence, of course, but it would explain the creation of the beasts from this image in regions outside of Paldea. In fact, it could be that the distance from Area Zero is why the imaginary Pokemon is created in 3 parts instead of 1, too far from the source of power. It could also explain the appearance of the Swords of Justice. However, we know a lot less about their backstory, just that they happen to have a not too dissimilar origin story to the legendary beasts. All of them part of a trio. All of them born by fire. The shared heights among the trio like Entei and Cobalion being the same height, and their tie into the Paldea region through the Scarlet and Violet book.
Finally, with this idea that crystals can create reality, this may also tie into the Terra raid dens that appear all across the Paldea region. In fact, when it comes to the event Pokemon Charizard and Cinderace specifically, which aren't native to the Dex, it may be because the people of Paldea are thinking about it, because shortly before the events of Scarlet and Violet were Sword and Shield, where Leon, the undefeated champion, finally got defeated. I'm sure that match was watched all around the world many times over, and both Charizard and Cinderace are his ace Pokemon. With all this in mind, this means that the Paradox Pokemon have likely existed in the crater for a long time, perhaps since just after the ultimate weapon struck 3,000 years ago. These Pokemon were generated by the life force of Pokemon that was landing down and destroying the world. This explains why Roaring Moon and Iron Valiant at least look a little bit more like their Mega counterparts. But ultimately, these Pokemon exist exist because of the future idea of these Pokemon, and of course the Pokemon ultimately also being sent back in time by Sada and Churro in the future. They exist because they exist, which is why they are paradox Pokemon. They are biological though, and they do date back to potentially up to 3,000 years ago and at least 2,000 years ago. They do have biology that mimics the real counterparts of these Pokemon that do definitely exist. But they certainly don't share a direct ancestry with these Pokemon. They're kind of like convergent evolution, which of course is referenced for the first time properly in this generation, with convergent evolution being a thing. Except these Pokemon didn't evolve. They were created by the disc Pokemon, which tapped into the imagination of the Paldean people to drive Heath and then eventually Sada and Churro to create the time machine, and more importantly, the Terra Orbs, for the next phase of its plan, which I'll describe in a video about the DLC in the future. This is the brand new Pokemon Terapagos, the Indigo disc that's coming out with Part 2 of the Area Zero DLC. It is the turtle disc Pokemon that we've seen in Heath's expedition journal, the Scarlet and Violet book, and now everything makes sense. The history of this Pokemon, the lore of the Pokemon world, that video I did explaining the paradox Pokemon and how they came to be and how they are part of this Pokemon's will, now it all makes sense. It even makes sense, the line where Mrs. Rhyfort talks about how the Great Crater is 1,000,000 years old, a line I previously disagreed with her on. But now, actually, everything is clear to me, so let me break down the lore and the story for you right now. Terapagos is 1,000,000 years old, and if you've seen the tweets, and you might have think this is all just a meme, but there are images out there of the Paldea region and how it kind of looks like Terapagos. It looks like it's the exact same shape, with the Great Crater representing the diamond in the middle of the back. The little head can clearly be seen. The tail can be seen where the clouds are in the top right-hand corner of the map. Is it possible that the Paldea region was once a giant Terapagos, or perhaps this very same one that we saw in the DLC? I actually think so. Game Freak doesn't design things like this unintentionally, and I am pretty convinced. Assume this with me, that over 1,000,000 years ago, there was in fact a giant turtle, Terapagos, which by the way is inspired by both the Galapagos turtles, but also the world turtle mythology, the mythology of a turtle who carries the world on its back. This turtle was giant, absolutely huge, possibly the biggest Pokemon we've ever seen, bigger still than Gigantamax or Eternamax Eternatus. It drifted upon an ancient Pokemon sea, and as it grew in size, it didn't have a lot of places left to move, so it docked south of the Kalos region, and there its shell became still enough for Pokemon and people and plants, much like Torterra, which shares that same world turtle inspiration, to grow and begin to thrive on the surface of its shell. It's interesting to note that turtles do in fact shed their shells, and this would be the case with Terapagos, who once settled would stay still for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even 1,000,000 years. Its back becoming an island, its old shell becoming the shape of the Paldea region, as we've seen in the tweets and the memes. And at the core of this Pokemon, on the back of its shell, something special, a power that has allowed it to grow so incredibly big and live so incredibly long, a form of infinity energy. Now, we've seen this throughout the franchise, and no matter what you call it, whether it's infinity energy, whether it's aura, whether it's primal energy, whether it's Gigantamax energy, whether it's the power of the Z crystals, the light that Necrozma produces, or even that of the Ultra Wormhole that allows Pokemon to become big, becoming totem Pokemon, or perhaps the power of Archus that causes the noble Pokemon and alpha Pokemon to be huge, and we also see this same energy, the Gigantamax energy, transforming Eternatus into the Eternamax Eternatus. We know what this energy is capable of. Generally speaking, no matter what form it takes and what label you give it, it has the same powers. The ability to grow and shrink Pokemon, the ability to power up moves or change the form of a Pokemon, and the ability to manipulate the life force of Pokemon as well. We see this in AZ and AZ's Floette, who have lived for an exceptionally long time, or the life and death trio in general, with Xerneas and Yveltal having the power to manipulate life. These I've mentioned before: Zygarde, Eternatus, Necrozma, and now this, Terapagos, I believe is the fourth part of what we call the Arceus, the thing that Arceus gets its name from. But I'll digress from that for now, because I'm sure you've heard about that in my other videos. This enormous turtle was asleep underneath the Paldea region for over 1,000,000 years, and that is how the Great Crater has existed for so long, the peak point that is in that turtle's back. But there was something down there, something that people of other regions wanted, and as I've expressed in my video about the history of the Paradox Pokemon and the history of the Paldea region, I believe this is when the war with Kalos happened 3,000 years ago. The ultimate weapon fired, infinity energy went up into the air, and when it came back down, it was drawn to an incredibly powerful source nearby, the back of the shell of this Pokemon. And what that blast did ultimately was change the Great Crater into Area Zero. I also believe it caused the power of the infinity energy that was sourced there to ripple out across the region, creating Terra Rage Dens and Terastallization in general. Again, watch that other video to find out more about that. But what effect did it have on Terapagos? Well, in that previous video, I mentioned that perhaps it opened a wormhole which blasted this Pokemon through to another dimension, which is why in Heath's drawing, it appears to be in some other dimensional space. But now, if we're working with the assumption that Terapagos at that time was not a weapon being used by some king of an ancient Paldea, but instead a creature slumbering underneath the Paldea region, a region that used to be its shell, this Pokemon would have been affected by the blast. And I think the key thing that happened to this enormous Pokemon is that it shrunk in size. We don't actually know the current size of Terapagos. It might be, in fact, that it is an exceptionally big Pokemon, but I suspect for game balancing reasons, the Pokemon will not be as big as an entire region. I suspect struck at the core of its back, this Pokemon shrank, and all of the energy that was inside it was released into the region in the form of Terra energy. In fact, it might be this that changed Terapagos to have all of the elemental types on its back, or it may be the case that it already had that. It doesn't really matter. The point is that at this point, Terapagos left from underneath Area Zero. Perhaps by choice, it left into the depths of the ocean, or what's more likely based on the depiction in Heath's journal, flew off into space. We don't know the specific typing of this Pokemon, but it certainly, I wouldn't surprise me if it was dragon and had the ability to fly in some way. It's interesting to note that it was only in a recent game in Pokemon Legend Arceus where Professor Lavington said that Pokemon have a natural ability to shrink, a sort of reverse of Gigantamax and Dynamax, where in the Dynamax Rage Dens, a big red light kind of spews out of the top of the Rage Dens, not too dissimilar to the red light that comes out of a Pokeball to then shrink the Pokemon back down. I believe that while Eternatus, which was likely hit 3,000 years ago because that's when the Darkest Day was as well, flying through the sky became Eternamax Eternatus and grew in size, the opposite was true for such a big Pokemon in Terapagos. Instead, it shrank down and then disappeared into space, into another dimension, or maybe into the depths of the ocean. Perhaps it moved offshore and a new metallic island was built on top of it, and that's the area that we're going to in the DLC. I guess that remains to be seen. But that truly explains how the crater where Area Zero is now is in fact 1,000,000 years old. And in fact, we might be seeing another reference to Gigantamax in the fact that Gigantamax Pokemon are usually depicted with clouds circling around them. And if Terapagos really was once as big as the entire Paldea region before it shed its shell and left this region alone, is it possible that those clouds at the heart of Area Zero are a swirling form of energy similar to Gigantamax? I digress. There is one more bit of evidence that I think is absolutely fantastic that harkens all the way back to the days of Pokemon Red and Blue, and that is in the Pokemon Wartortle, and this is going to blow your mind. For Wartortle, much like Terapagos, is similarly shaped. It's a turtle, and a tortoise instead of a turtle. It has that fluffy tail, which is said to be a symbol of longevity. Why? It is thought that Wartortle in particular, not Blastoise, not Squirtle, is able to live for over 10,000 years. But where would this idea have come from? Well, perhaps it was from the people of Kanto who saw Wartortle and played a little game of mental association all the way back to the ancient stories of Terapagos, a blue turtle that looks not too dissimilar with a big fluffy tail, a sign of longevity, an ancient Pokemon, and that's where the stories of Wartortle come from. And that is how Mrs. Rifle is completely correct in that the crater around Paldea that will one day become known as Area Zero is in fact over 1,000,000 years old, because the Paldea region is the back of an ancient Terapagos, this same one that we'll meet in the DLC that had been struck by the ultimate weapon and ultimately shrunk down. Make sure to subscribe, I'm only giving you my best from now on. So hi, Pokemon Masters. Terastal Pokemon, don't they look brilliant? I love the way they gleam and shine, but what's the face about in the crown of each of these Pokemon? I'll be honest, I think I would have preferred the design of Terastal Pokemon if they didn't have their hats, but clearly they do. It's an important part of the design, and every single one has the gem on the forehead with what looks to be an angry pair of eyes inside. I think I know what it's about. It's about the third legendary, or perhaps even about Arceus, so let me explain. To look to the future though, we need to look to the past. Arguably, no generation's legendary group has had more impact in the series than Generation 4. Up until that point, legendary Pokemon like Lugia and Ho-Oh, Mewtwo, Groudon and Kyogre, they were big, powerful titans of the Pokemon world, but not really tied into the creation mythos in any way. Generation 4 changed all of that by having legendary Pokemon that were more than legendary Pokemon, the deities. Underneath Arceus, the legendary dragons Dialga and Palkia, each of them with a representative gemstone, a diamond and a pearl, the adamant and lustrous orb. Arceus itself with gemstones in the body, it's going to be relevant for a number of videos on the channel coming up, but here's the thing, that trend continued hugely into the next generation, Generation 5, Kyurem, Zekrom, and Reshiram. They were once known as the original dragon. Kyurem takes on this crystallized ice form, and it is thought that dragon energy in the Pokemon world used to be crystallized. Just look to Regigigas' Pokedex entry for that. This is the origin of dragon energy in the Pokemon world. And then, from there on, first we had Zygarde, a dragon-type Pokemon that had a perfect form. It wasn't complete until you combined together all of the cores to get 100%. Those cores, while they were cells, did seem to have some kind of rock-like element to them, which explains the ground typing of Zygarde. Zygarde had a mastery over life and death, and it's that same energy that's responsible for Mega Evolution. Then, in the next generation, we get yet another dragon, this time the Necrozma. Now, Necrozma is not in its dragon form until it's in its perfect form and it's absorbed Solgaleo and Lunala. It too exudes a special energy in the form of rocks with the Z crystal that is said to be part of its body. Interestingly, that same energy seeps through the Ultra Wormholes, causing Pokemon to become Totem Pokemon, changing their form, much in the same way that Mega Evolution changes the form of Pokemon. Still, Totem Pokemon were only changing the size of the Pokemon. Oh wait! Another generation later, we get yet another dragon with Eternatus, which has a more complete form, a final form. And yes, it's a dragon, and yes, it exudes energy, and that energy comes in the form of rocks, the wishing stars that are part of its body, and that energy allows Pokemon to, once again, transform and become bigger. So this idea of space rocks coming from the bodies of dragons that have their normal form, that are as powerful as any other legendary Pokemon, but then these exceptionally powerful forms, the Perfect Zygarde, Ultra Necrozma, Gmax Eternatus, these Pokemon go above and beyond what other Pokemon are capable of doing. They also channel a great energy that allows them to transform, size up, and influence other Pokemon. We actually see this power as well in Legends Arceus being projected by Arceus to create the Noble and Alpha Pokemon. So it seems that all of these energies are different reflections of that same power that Arceus wields. In fact, it's been described multiple times that Infinity Energy is the life essence of Pokemon. It's the same thing that Aura is described as, and this too translates to the Z Crystals and Totem Pokemon, and of course Noble Pokemon and Gigantamax Pokemon. They're all different expressions of the same energy, so we're all on the same page, and all of these come from gemstones that are part of the body of a middle legendary Pokemon. So, what do we think about Terastallization? Is that the right word? Terra Pokemon. What do you think? Where do you think the gemstones come from? The rocks that cover their body and power them up? Potentially a middle legendary Pokemon, and that face on their head, the face of a legendary Pokemon. We know that all of these energies share a tie to the life essence of Pokemon. Is it possible that the rocks that are bestowed upon the Pokemon that are in battle when they Terastallize are alive, that those faces are actually the consciousness of the middle legendary so far unrevealed for the region? I think it's likely, and I think it's likely that that Pokemon will be a dragon, but there's another element to this that ties it all together so perfectly. Arceus. We've just had Legends Arceus, a game where I theorized that Arceus should have a more complete form, and Arceus talks in the game about having chosen this form, this body that it uses. I suspect if we could see Arceus's true form, we wouldn't really even be able to perceive it. It is a form greater than anything else. The word Arceus comes from a term in alchemy, the Arceus, and if you've watched a bunch of Lockstin's videos, you'll know all about alchemy and how it was all building up and spilling towards the end of Pokemon, back when Generation 6 was coming out, but I don't think that was the case. I do think something big is going to happen with Gen 10 though, because this generation with the Crystal Pokemon marks the end of something that Pokemon has been building up to since Generation 5. See, the Arceus in alchemy is made up of 4 components, 4 key components. I'll tell you 3 now. They are life, light, and poison. These are easily attributable to the main legendary Pokemon of the last few generations. Zygarde is the Dragon of Life, wielding the life energy of Xerneas and Yveltal and projecting that into Mega Evolution. Necrozma is obviously the essence of light. It is the Dragon of Light and wields that energy and turns it into the Z crystals. Chemical makes sense for the poison type Eternatus, whose energy seeps into the ground of the Galar region, into the wishing stars, and into the bodies of yet other Pokemon, transforming them. So what is the 4th part of the Arceus? What is the 4th element? Well, it's a term called reflective. And reflective is a word that I thought initially might apply to the original dragon. After all, Kyurem is a giant ice crystal, so maybe that's reflective. But you know what's more reflective and more of a crystal than a giant piece of ice? The actual crystallization of Pokemon. You even see in the raid den the reflections of the Pokemon as you have to battle them. The big middle legendary of Scarlet and Violet is going to be a Pokemon that represents reflective. I expect it to be a huge crystal dragon, and given that it is able to reflect multiple types, I expect it to be some kind of giant multi-type creature, and this is what we're going to see, something that can channel into the many types of Arceus perhaps. But basically some giant crystal dragon that will have a base form, much like Xerneas, much like Eternatus, much like Necrozma, but then it will have a more complete form, a form that is a final boss of the game. And if you were, in my opinion, to take those 4 big bosses and combine them with Arceus, you would have the true god of the Pokemon world. I think by this game focusing on Crystal and that 4th part of the Arceus, as it's known in the real world, we're seeing the end of some kind of journey here. Not a reboot theory, I don't think Pokemon's gonna reboot, but we have to remember that the next generation is Generation 10. Gen 10, and we'll have hit over 1,000 Pokemon either just before or just after that happens. It's 30 years for the franchise, and the franchise has to be thinking about its future, so I do expect some kind of big shift in the way Pokemon operates after this game. I think that means something big is coming as we now begin to understand the Pokemon pantheon just a little bit better, with Arceus at the top and Dialga and Palkia being emissaries of it, Giratina as well. But then there are these 4 micro gods, I guess. Zygarde, Necrozma, Eternatus, and whatever the face in the crown represents, that is going to be the final 3rd legendary and the final piece of Arceus that will appear in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. We all know the tale of the legendary beasts from 150 years ago in Ecruteak City, deep in the heart of the Johto region. However, Pokemon lore has been flipped on its head recently with the introduction of the Scarlet book, which depicted what I will be calling for this video the Scarlet Beast, a creature from 200 years ago before the existence of Raikou, Entei, and Suicune that looks an awful lot like them. Now, with the release of Walking Wake and the presumed existence of future Paradox Raikou, Entei, and Suicune as a trio, there is some explaining to do. And no, this video is not just an excuse to show off some nice artwork by Alex Allen, but I will say, dang, good job, Alex Allen. Go follow on Instagram. So let's start with what we know about Paradox Pokemon, and I've already done a whole video recently on exactly how Paradox Pokemon work, linked in the description. So Paradox Pokemon seem to sit somewhere between reality and imagination. People aren't quite sure or decided whether they are the result of the imagination of the professors or the people of Paldea, or whether they are somehow from alternate timelines, allowing the time travel aspect of the story to be real. All you need to know is that it is up for debate as to exactly how Paradox Pokemon link into their biological counterparts, and it seems that they are unrelated. However, I think for the legendary beasts of Johto, there might be a special exception here. They might be different to other Paradox Pokemon, similar to how Koraidon and Miraidon are similar to Cyclizar in a way that seems different to the other Paradox Pokemon's connection to their biological living counterparts. So if the Pokemon timeline is anything to go by, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are happening around 20 to 25 years after the events of Pokemon Gold and Silver. Gold and Silver is happening 150 years after the events of the Burnt Tower, which means Scarlet and Violet are happening about 175 years or 170 years after the events of the Burnt Tower. Don't worry, you don't need to keep that in mind. I'll bring up the numbers when they become important later, but for what you need to know right now is about 170 to 175 years before the events of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, there were 2 towers in the Johto region in Ecruteak City. There was actually another tower previous to this that was in Goldenrod City that became dilapidated. It's where they built the Goldenrod Radio Tower, and that's why the director of the Radio Tower has, depending on the version of the game you're playing, a Rainbow Silverwing or Crystal/Clearbell to give you. It's possible at that point that this was Ho-Oh's roosting spot, explaining why it's called Goldenrod City because of the golden nature of Ho-Oh, and it being close to the ruins of Alph where Ho-Oh is depicted. Anyway, I digress. In Ecruteak City, 175 years prior to the events of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, there were 2 towers, one in the east and one in the west. The western tower was the home of Lugia, and the eastern tower the one of Ho-Oh. However, and the story is different depending on the canon that you're looking at, whether that's the manga, the main series, the Pokemon Generations episode, or the games. A different set, but similar set of events happened. The tower was being burgled, it was a time of war, it was a freak thunderstorm, or perhaps if you believe the theories, the thunderstorm was created by the flapping of Lugia's wings, as referenced in the Pokedex entries. Either way, the tower in the west fell. It fell to a massive fire, thunderstorm and rainstorm that came along and destroyed it. Lugia disappeared off to the Whirl Islands, but trapped inside were 3 Pokemon, and we still to this day do not know what those Pokemon are. If you look at the depiction in Pokemon Generations, it suggests that there may be something a little bit more like Houndour, although Pokemon theories have suggested the connection to the legendary beasts with Jolteon, Vaporeon, and Flareon. The Kimono girls live in the Critique City after all, and are big evolution users, but again, I digress. I believe the depictions in Generations to not be taken too seriously. I think they are just to be interpreted however you like. Nonetheless, the tower burned and the Pokemon were trapped inside, until Ho-Oh displayed powers that we haven't seen Ho-Oh display anywhere else in the series. Somehow, it revived these 3 creatures and brought new life in Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. But the odd thing is here is that this is happening 25 to 30 years after the depiction that appears in the Scarlet Book, the Scarlet Beast, a combination of all 3 of these Pokemon inspired by Heath's team going down into Area Zero in the Paldea region, a world away, seemingly completely disconnected. Heath's artist drew this inspired by the creatures that they saw down in Area Zero, and when the games first came out and we didn't have the DLC to work with, we were to take this as they were inspired by Pokemon like Iron Treads and Great Tusk. Of course, in Violet version this is different, there's Iron Leaves, and I'm not 100% sure on the story when it comes to the Swords of Justice, but maybe I'll talk about that in a future video. Now we know about the existence of Walking Wake. My belief is that the artist saw Walking Wake and perhaps 2 other Pokemon representing Entei and Raikou down there in Area Zero, and that those Pokemon then fled. They were moving so quickly that this is what Heath's artist came up with, a combination of all 3, the Scarlet Beast. So is it possible that these events are linked? I actually believe so. I believe that we're going to get Raikou and Entei's paradox forms in parts 1 and 2 of the DLC. We have Walking Wake right now. Walking Wake right now is not actually available to you in the Paldea region. Yes, you can find them in the Terra Raid dens, but the Terra Raid dens seem to be creating Pokemon. The mightiest Pokemon that don't naturally exist in the region. Cinderace, Charizard, Greninja, these Pokemon aren't actually part of the Paldean Pokedex, and right now if you catch your one and only Walking Wake in the same vein, it doesn't have a Pokedex entry. Walking Wake is being reimagined here in the Paldea region for some reason. Similarly, both Part 2 and 3 talk about areas away from the main Paldea region. One of these is an artificial city in the sea, a sort of the Blueberry Academy. And separate to that, there is the land of Kitakami that I just released a video on, the deep lore behind that. That seems to be part of the overall Japanese country that appears in the Pokemon world. This is described by Professor Oak in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl as Hoenn, Johto, Kanto, and Sinnoh being part of the same country, likely inspired by their real-world Japanese counterparts. This is the Japanese country of the Pokemon world, and Kitakami is part of that. It's also interesting to note that the Walking Wake has the ability to walk on water when you throw it out of its Pokeball in the overworld. So my belief is that after their appearance in Area Zero 200 years ago, they left and ended up finding their way to this Japanese country in the Pokemon world. At the time, trade between these regions, Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, Sinnoh, or as it was known then, Hisui, was pretty common. The Hisui culture was finally beginning to build up after the savage Pokemon of the Hisui region had been tamed by a hero around that time. Now, Jubilife Village was expanding. It wasn't just the Diamond and Pearl clans that were there, and the Celestica people who had been there for a long time had mostly died out. But most of the traversal for the last several hundred to thousand years was being done by a seafaring people who brought with them the lore and the culture of the areas they had visited, explaining why there is so many shared bits of architecture and culture across these regions. These ancient lorekeepers were the Draconids whose home had been destroyed 2,000 years prior. Their traces can be seen all the way across this region. From the Regi Caves and Temples, the Sinjo ruins, the ruins of Alph, the Tanboy ruins, the Salacion ruins as well, the Cave of Origin, the Sky Pillar, the Spear Pillar, and the Embedded Tower in Johto. If you look close enough, it seems that these people have been traveling around exchanging information and the lore of the Pokemon world, sealing away great threats. They also seem to be very prolific with dragon Pokemon, with various dragon clans appearing in all of these regions. In Johto, we have the Dragon Clan to the north, we have Hassel, who now appears in the Paldea region. As well as that, there are the people of Celestic Town, of which both Drasna and Cynthia are descendants of this same clan, the clan that used to be where the ancient retreat was in Hisui. And the reason this is important is there's a second organization, a second group of people that seem very connected to all of this culture and infrastructure that's across all of these regions of the Pokemon world, the Kimono Girls. The Kimono Girls, of course, have their main base in Ecruteak City, and they are Lorekeepers of Lugia and Ho-Oh and the legendary beasts. They are the ones who brought the Togepi egg to Mr. Pokemon, and also those who gave Mr. Pokemon the Jade Orb, a direct connection to Rayquaza. They are the ones who tell the history and the story of the Johto region. It's also possible that the Diamond and Pearl clans of Hisui have their origins with the Kimono Girls, given the evolutions that have a high presence on both Adamant and Irida's team. However, being an evolution user alone isn't normally enough. We do think, though, for sure, that Valerie is a Kimono Girl, given the fact that she wears what's called a Furisode, which is a type of kimono. All of the trainers in her gym wear Furisodes. She is said to come from the Johto region, from a town where history is kept safe. This fact is actually confirmed in Pokemon Masters, and in the original Japanese game in anime, she has a Kyoto dialect, which is what Ecruteak City is inspired by. And these Furisode or Kimono Girls across the world are still guarding ancient ruins today. They can be seen guarding the Cave of Origin as well as the Sky Pillar in Hoenn. So these Lorekeepers of the ancient Pokemon world take their vows and family legacies very, very seriously, still guarding all of the various ancient ruins and relics of the legendary Pokemon today. There is another area as well in the spin-off games that it looks like these people have traveled to defend ancient secrets, and that would be the Fjord region from Pokemon Ranger. There is Summertown, which is much like the Seafolk Village and Pacificdog Town, and above it, the Jungle Relic. It bears the same markings of Groudon and Kyogre and Rayquaza that we see in the Sky Pillar and the Cave of Origin. And similarly, there is also another temple that shares this legacy. But inside this temple, which is guarded by ancient dragon trials that only Dragon Masters should be able to deal with, you as a Pokemon Ranger will find yourself face to face with a statue of Entei, of all Pokemon. And Entei, Raikou, and Suicune will make their way further into the region and become antagonists in the game. Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and Sinnoh are all deeply tied together, whether it's with unknown ruins, the legendary beasts, Groudon, Kyogre, Rayquaza, heck, even the Latis. But I digress. This is simply to illustrate that unlike the other regions of the Pokemon world, whose lore and legends seem to be relatively separate to one another, apart from perhaps the Kalos regions and Galar and Paldea, which are all relatively close together, that these Japanese-inspired Pokemon regions really do seem to have cross-contamination across their legends. In fact, in almost every single game since Generation 1, if Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno appear, so too does Lugia. The exceptions really being Kalos, where the Sea Spirit's Den appears, this being in Azure Bay, a direct reference to Lugia itself, and being pretty close in geographical terms to the Crown Tundra, which is where, yet again, another Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno appear, or in the Sinnoh region, where the birds are roaming. Lugia doesn't appear in the Sinnoh region, but it does show that these birds have an ability and a propensity to roam and fly about the wider Pokemon world. So too is the case for Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, though, who typically appear alongside Ho-Oh no matter which game you're looking at. But to fully understand their connection to Ho-Oh, I think we need to go back to that day 170 years before the events of Scarlet and Violet in the Johto region when that tower burnt down. I believe the 3 Pokemon trapped inside were Walking Wake and 2 other Paradox Pokemon that matched Entei and Raikou. If Walking Wake is anything to go by with its Water Dragon typing, I expect the Entei to be Fire Dragon and the Raikou to be Electric Dragon type. Pokemon of deep interest and concern to the Kimono people and dragon clans of the Johto region at that time. I believe that these Pokemon were trapped in the tower. Perhaps they were even the reason for the tower to fall. Perhaps they aggravated and attacked Lugia. We can't know for sure, but these Pokemon perished. And then to revive them and to end this madness, Ho-Oh appeared, revived them and transformed them anew. But it did so using not its own power, but instead the power of the unknown. I previously mentioned that Ho-Oh appears in the ruins of Alph depicted alongside them, and I believe it wielded their mighty power. Their power to create things out of crystal, as we see in the 3rd movie where they create an Entei directly using exactly this power. The unknown have the ability of imagination and reality warping. We even see something that looks not too dissimilar to the unknown on the headgear of the Draconids in the manga, but I digress, that's just a side point. The unknown, whose powers of creation seem to be about tapping into the mind of another being, whether in the case of Arceus helping it create Giratina, Dialga, and Palkia, either at the beginning of time or in the Sinjar Ruins event, or in this case, perhaps tapping into the mind of Ho-Oh or the people of Ecruteak City. These Paradox Pokemon were transformed, perhaps in the image of Jolteon, Vaporeon, and Flareon, common icons in Ecruteak City, or perhaps in the image of the Scarlet Beast, which was entering the public consciousness at that time. At this point in time, the Scarlet and Violet book had been out for around 20 to 30 years. And as I've mentioned before, by seeing a book that looks to me to be a lot like the Violet book in Kogita's Hut, an asset in the game that seems to be completely unique, not anywhere else. I can't not see this as a direct reference. We know that the Scarlet and Violet book had made its way to this Japan Pokemon region. In fact, it would probably have been through the Kitakami exchange program that we're going to see in the DLC. And so these 3 Paradox Pokemon that had appeared in Ecruteak City one day found their way to this tower through some incident or another. It's been very vague. The tower burnt down, and in the image of the Scarlet Beast, which was in the minds and imagination of the people at that time, or perhaps in the image of Flareon, Jolteon, and Vaporeon that would also be in the minds of the people of that area, these Pokemon were given new life. Suicune first, as in Crystal version, the sages that used Jolteon, Flareon, and Vaporeon to defend the remaining tower actually mentioned that Suicune has a special connection to the unknown, perhaps through the crystal on its head. And these Pokemon follow Ho-Oh everywhere across the Pokemon world, feeling very indebted to it, either as individuals, one of a kind, or perhaps as a new species of legendary Pokemon, but now for the first time, actually real. Of course, you might wonder how this would work in a timeline that focuses on Pokemon Violet version, but I suspect the 2 timelines are very connected, and this whole process of creation through imagination or alternate timelines, the Pokemon still exist in each game. The past Paradox Pokemon can be traded into Violet and the future ones into Scarlet, so I do wonder what the story would be with the Swords of Justice. But now given new life, the 3 legendary beasts follow Ho-Oh around, the Pokemon they feel indebted to who granted them new life through the wishes of the people of Ecruteak City who recreated these Pokemon in the images of Pokemon they were more familiar with, less monstrous Pokemon. I love... Recently, we took a look at the paradoxical Walking Wake and the potential for Raikou and Entei to get the same treatment, and the origins of the legendary beasts as a whole. But what about the legendary birds of the Kanto region? If they even are from the Kanto region. Because unlike the beasts, the Regis, the Lake Guardians of other regions whose origin stories are explained and homes decided, the birds of Kanto seem disconnected to their home. They don't really have a trio master in the same way the beasts do to Ho-Oh. You of course could argue Lugia, but that seems to be almost anime exclusive with only brief references in the game. I'll get to those shortly. Not only that, but as we go through the generations, it seems that the legendary bird's home may be in the Pokemon European continent, somewhere around Kalos or Paldea, and in fact, not anything to do with Kanto after all. Of course, they first appeared in Kanto. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, Moltres moved down to the Sevi Islands, which is sort of the video game version of the Orange Islands. This, of course, connects in with the potential Johto connection with Lugia, as seen in the movie 2000. In Pokemon Platinum, they are flying around the Sinnoh region, never really roosting anywhere, and in Kalos they do much the same, but they do eventually settle in the Sea Spirit's Den. The name Sea Spirit's Den in Azure Bay may well be a reference to Lugia, and the fact that it's a den might tie into Galar. We'll get there in a moment, but first there's the Alola region, which doesn't directly reference these Pokemon, but it is interesting to note that a lot of the Polynesian culture that's seen in the Alola region is also celebrated in the festival on Shamuti Island in the movie 2000. The Orange or Sevi Islands aren't far from the Alola region, relatively speaking, if you're comparing Hawaii to Japan, so it does make sense. Alola even shares some of that Cantonian and Jotonian culture as seen in the Maui Garden. But then there's the Galar region, where suddenly the legendary birds got a whole new set of lore. They appear both underground in the Max Raid Lair, which is effectively a giant set of Max Raid dens, and again there's that dens words again. Interesting, dens on either side of the Pokemon world's equivalent of the English Channel. And then there are those that appear above ground in the Crown Tundra itself, the Galarian legendary birds. These forms of Moltres, Zapdos, and Articuno, all three, have Pokedex entries suggesting themselves to perhaps be the originals. For Zapdos, it's suggested that when its feathers rub together, they produce a crackling sound like the zapping of electricity, hence why it's called Zapdos. Known as Articuno, this Pokemon fires beams that immobilize and freeze opponents. That's where it gets the name Arctic Uno or Arctic One. And then, of course, there's Moltres, that has a sinister aura that blazes around it like molten fire, suggesting where it got the name Moltres. Perhaps these three versions of the legendary birds, as well as the theming of the Crown Tundra being a sort of land that time forgot with lots of fossil Pokemon living around in it, suggest that they are older variants of the Pokemon. The shiny variants of the Galarian legendary birds resemble the modern day variants in coloration. Perhaps this coloration used to be a lot more common. Keep that in mind for now. But it seems to me if we want to learn the origins of the legendary birds, and I say this as a bird keeper, we want to be looking at the Galarian forms. Even though to call them Galarian may too be a mistake. mistake, for in Galar legend, there is not much talk of these 3 Pokemon. We do see on the mural for the Darkest Day 3 birds flying in the sky above the heroes of legend, but they're all flying, and Galarian Zapdos doesn't fly like the others. Perhaps the flying variants became more common in Galar over time, which is how these Pokemon got named the Galarian variants, but ultimately they're from somewhere else, because the Pokemon website confirms that these 3 Pokemon don't actually live in the Galar region. They instead migrate to visit the Power Spot tree. So where are they migrating in from? Well, again, across that European Pokemon channel to the other side of the sea, where there's not just the Pokemon world equivalent of France, but also Spain and Portugal. Here we find the origins for the name: Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres. Uno, dos, tres. 1, 2, 3 in Spanish, or Paldean. And when we imagine these Pokemon coming from the Paldea region, it actually makes a lot of sense. When we meet them in the main wild area, Crown Tundra and Isle of Armor, these 3 Pokemon are roaming in wide open spaces, and there's no more open space than the Paldea region currently. You can just imagine Articuno flying over the Glacedo mountain range, Moltres keeping warm the smoliv fields of southern Paldea, and roaming the desert of the Paldea region. There you would find this version of Zapdos. How would any of this tie into Lugia? That's something I might talk about in a future video. I have a really cool video planned that might be out in like 6 months, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that lore deep dive into Lugia. It's gonna be a cool video when I get around to making it. But what I do want to talk about is this idea of regular Pokemon transforming into legends, either by the will of legendary Pokemon or perhaps by events happening in the world. We've seen this before with Carbink Diancie, or the relationship between Cyclizar and Koraidon and Miraidon right here in Paldea. In the last video, I mentioned the possibility of the transformation of Raikou, Entei, and Suicune to reflect the imagery of Flareon, Jolteon, or Vaporeon, or perhaps from Walking Wake itself. Again, click that video, link in the description. And the Paldea region is full of potential birds that might have transformed into these legends. Squawkabilly, no. Bombardier, no. Kilowattrel does seem like a mini Zapdos, but again, I want to look at those original Galarian, or as I'm going to call them, Paldean variants. And sure enough, in the Acedo Desert, not capable to run quite as fast, is the vicious and ferocious Espathra. It's described as surprisingly vicious, matching Zapdos' temperament, and it has abilities, psychic powers that make this Pokemon so important it's on the champion team. Articuno is based on the various birds of paradise, and in the Paldea region, the birds from Alola appear, the various forms of Oricorio. And when you look to the Sensu style, you could totally see a relationship from that to Articuno. This form of Oricorio, according to the Pokedex, has sipped purple nectar, and it uses ethereal dance steps to call forth the spirits of the dead. It's a rare sight in Paldea. And this idea of calling forth spirits and Pokemon reincarnating matches the idea of the legendary beasts in Johto. But there's one Pokemon that hits this nail on the head perfectly in the Paldea region, and that is the Pokemon that will become Moltres. Moltres, of course, is inspired by the Phoenix, a creature able to resurrect itself after death. It shares this quality again with the legendary beasts of Johto and perhaps with Ho-Oh itself. And while both the ghost form of Oricorio and Espathra have connections to supernatural powers that might give new life after death, there is one Pokemon that is able to do this clearly, and that is Skeledirge. Or rather, the bird that sits at the front of Skeledirge's snout. This to me is the most compelling case. You see, the fire within Fuecoco is unable to be contained, and so when it evolves into Crocalor, it becomes an egg, and when it evolves a step further, that egg hatches into a new spirit bird. As Skeledirge, it gains the ghost typing, and it now has a connection to the afterlife, and when it sings, it does so with the power of the firebird that sits at the end of its snout. We've seen Pokemon create other Pokemon before, by the way, in the form of like Cubone and Kangaskhan, for example, but the most recent and modern example of this is actually with the last fire starter, fully evolved. No, I'm not talking about Cinderace, I'm talking about Hisuian Typhlosion, another fire ghost type that attacks with up to 108 ghostly Will-O-Wisps, according to the Pokemon website. 108 is not an accidental number either, because we all know that this is the number that represents the amount of purple spirits that makes up Spiritomb, a totally different Pokemon. What happens when these 108 spirits it attacks with get lost and get separated from the original Typhlosion? The same question applies here with Skeledirge and its Firebird. What happens to that Firebird when the Pokemon attacks and there's no Pokemon for it to return to, perhaps because the Pokemon has fainted or been withdrawn into a Pokeball? What happens when this Fire Spirit with its own soul goes rogue? The Pokedex entry for Skeledirge makes it a little clearer. Rumor has it that this bird was born when the Fireball on Skeledirge's head gained a soul, suggesting it's its own Pokemon. It's interesting because Skeledirge knows the move Torch Song, which it would use to attack with this Pokemon. But it seems odd to me that this fire ghost type singing Pokemon doesn't learn the move Perish Song. Perhaps because to do so would mean that the soul of the bird would be set free, and reborn into the legendary Phoenix Pokemon, Moltres. Perhaps that's where the original Galarian or Paldean Moltres came from, and in its shiny form it looks just like it. Perhaps this is where eventually all Moltres and Zapdos and Articuno would evolve and separate out from, becoming regional variants. But these three originals all came from various birds that appear in the Paldea region, which is where they get their name from. Moltres, Zapdos, and Articuno. Pokemon's always been big on environmental storytelling since the days of Red and Blue, when there was a truck on the Vermilion City docks that made us ask the question, how'd the truck get there, and is there a Mew under it? Or perhaps even recently with Sword and Shield, where there's an abandoned watchtower in the wild area, or damage on the walls of Hammerlock Castle, or even in Scarlet and Violet, where there's a giant crater at the heart of the Paldea region. All of these locations make us ask the question, how'd they get there? What's the story? What's the history? But the big piece that caught my eye while playing Scarlet and Violet was the necrosmatic black glass that's at the top of the mountain peaks in the northeastern part of the region, around all of the bamboo. Why is there bamboo here? Why does the music change to have this eastern influence? And what is with that glass? Is it something to do with Necrozma? Well, it turns out that this is just one part of environmental storytelling that links in with the Quartet of Ruin. 4 legendary Pokemon brought to life from Treasures of Ruin from a far-off eastern region. The story is told to you by Mrs. Rifle, the coolest of the teachers in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. She too loves Pokemon theories and Pokemon lore. And it's not just this northeastern portion of the map. You can see elements of their destruction all over Paldea. And now we can take all of these elements together to tell you a solid story, but these elements include everything from the Pokedex entries of the Quartet of Ruin to the story that Mrs. Rifle tells you, environmental storytelling, hints to the upcoming Teal Mask DLC, and Pokedex entries of other obscure Pokemon like Paldean and Wooper. There's a lot to cover, and that's why I'm joined today by Lumio's Post.
Hey Toby, thanks for having me. We were trying to look at Pokedex entries of Paldean Pokemon for 5 mini Paldea theories, which we actually cover over on my channel, and one we looked at was Paldean Wooper, a Pokemon that has evolved differently in Paldea to anywhere else in the world. But why? Water is abundant around Paldea, so why would Wooper need to evolve to be on the ground? It's said in original Wooper's entries that when it comes on land, it has to protect itself with a poisonous film so it doesn't dehydrate. And it seems that if it doesn't get back in the water quick enough, Paldean Wooper is the result. But that means Paldea has experienced some kind of drought at some time or another, causing Wooper to evolve this way and gain that poison typing. What happened here? Did Groudon show up?
Oh no, no Groudon. This is the doing of the legendary Quartet of Ruin. Chen Pao, Wu Chen, Ting Lu, and Chi Yu. Yes! Sorry, you have no idea how many times I tried to say that in recording. It was just a lot, and I am dyslexic, and it's just a lot of words. I don't know what this is. Big win, honestly, more than the theory, that's what deserves your like. Anyway, these are the Quartet of Ruin, brought to life from the Treasures of Ruin, bought by a merchant from the east during the time of the Paldean Empire. The Paldean Empire was 2,000 to 800 years ago, so it lasted for 1,200 years total. And smack bang in the middle, 1,500 years ago, is when I believe this happened, based on the Pokedex entries of Gimmighoul. Gimmighoul is a Pokemon that is always searching coin and was said to be brought to life 1,500 years ago. What does Gimmighoul have to do with any of this? Well, according to Mrs. Rifle, so the story goes, the merchant who bought these treasures from the east was ultimately showered with coins by a king who loved treasures. So he bought these off them and showered them with coins, and this connection to coins and 1,500 years ago being in the middle of the Paldean Empire makes sense to me. It also, because the ruins were ultimately stopped and sealed, means that it wasn't the end of the Paldean Empire. It just probably brought an end to that king's reign, destroying his many houses and castles and fortresses and watchtowers across the region, and sure enough, you can see them all over Paldea. Gimmighoul tend to live there, so I suspect Gimmighoul is connected to this, and this is going to become important later. The merchant who bought these cursed items was ultimately cursed themselves and became the ghost Pokemon Gimmighoul. Anyway, the treasure-loving king buys these treasures, the beads, the sword, the tablets with incredible writings on them, and the vessel. And then from them emerge these cursed dark-type Pokemon that bring ruin to the region. Starting off, let's take a look at the Firefish Chi Yu, which according to its Pokedex entry, blazes incredibly hot and swims through rivers of magma and lava that it creates. Now that's interesting because while there are clearly no rivers of magma running through the region today, there is some environmental storytelling that can tell us where there might once have been.
As Toby mentioned before, the black rock spires in the northeast are likely not as a result of necrozma, but instead obsidian glass. Razor-sharp glass created by intense heat. The idea is this area where the dragon Pokemon of the region largely live used to be ablaze with the power of Chi-Yu. It was so strong, it affected the entire province. After Chi-Yu was sealed away, the area began to cool, and it would make sense for bamboo to grow here, as bamboo grows very effectively in warmer climates. But specifically, we know which Pokemon stopped Chi-Yu. Wielded by one of the Pokemon heroes of that time was Baxcalibur. Baxcalibur's Pokedex entry says this Pokemon blasted cryogenic air out from its mouth. This air can instantly freeze even liquid hot lava. An interesting Pokedex entry, I'd say, given that there are no rivers of lava for it to freeze anymore. This is the story of the Northeast. So what about the other 3 ruinous Pokemon, and what the heck does Wooper have to do with anything?
Well, I suspect the land where you find the giant Titan Clorf in the southeast of Paldea to have been largely affected by Ting-Lu. Today, it is a barren wasteland. You can see the clay kind of matches Ting-Lu's design, generally speaking, and there is no vegetation there. And that's interesting because Clorf is a crab, a usually aquatic creature that looks an awful lot like Krabby and Kingler. So perhaps they're related, but clearly it's lost that water rock typing. At this point in time, it's actually weak to water type. And on top of that, the other Pokemon that you can find commonly in this area is Nacli, the Salt Rock Pokemon. Salt Rock is a wonderful part of environmental storytelling. It came up in Zelda Breath of the Wild as well, where the Salt Rock item, the deposits that you can find all across Hyrule, suggest the existence of an ancient sea that used to be where Hyrule was today. References to the Zelda the Wind Waker, and there's a whole theory about that. Anyway, that's Legend of Zelda, maybe you don't play that. The point is, salt rock forms where there used to be an ocean, where there used to be water, because the salt content in the water forms together to create these rocks, and in this case, in the Pokemon world, that's Nacli. That's what Nacli is. We see this with Garganacl as well, that exists in Area 0, which seems to have its own water cycle of having clouds constantly at the top, and then waterfalls that pool at the bottom. If it's in any way connected to the sea and that water is salt water, that's how the Garganacls are getting formed down there. So if there used to be a whole lot of water out in this area of the map that is now just dry and arid and barren, what happened to the water? Perhaps the water, as Lumios mentioned earlier with Wooper's Pokedex entry, disappeared suddenly, forcing Wooper to change and to constantly cover itself in this poisonous film, changing its typing because the water that was once there disappeared quickly. Where did it go? All of it contained, of course, within Ting-Lu's vase, within the vessel. Again, it is a magical vessel, so I think it's fair to assume that a whole lot more water could be stored in there than the literal handful that would fit within its dimensions. It's a legendary Pokemon. Now, the vessel today is broken, so what is the story being told to us here? Well, I believe, starting in the east, this Pokemon, which according to its Pokédex entries, the vessel contains the fears of the people of Paldea. It dried up the land, taking all of the water, affecting those kind of southern communities within Paldea, causing towns, more modern towns like Lavencia, to have to be built closer to the sea. It took all of the water from that area, making it completely barren and devoid of life, changing the ecosystem for Clorf and Wooper, and bringing about the existence of Nacli, and it continued to march northwest, and it got as far away as it possibly could before ultimately it was stopped. The vessel was cracked and the water was released, creating the Casseroya Lake, and there Ting-Lu was sealed away.
Then there's Chien-Pao and Wo-Chien. Wo-Chien is likely the slowest moving ruin and would likely have been left until last. It brought ruin to the fortress seen outside its lair by destroying a nearby forest. According to its Pokedex entries, it drains the life force from vegetation, causing nearby forests to instantly wither and fields to turn barren. Sure enough, just a little more northeast from its resting place is a barren swamp where nothing seems to grow. Chien-Pao, while sealed in the west, seems to have affected the northern side of Paldea. Its dex entry reads, "This Pokemon can control 100 tons of fallen snow. It plays around innocently by leaping in and out of avalanches it has caused. And sure enough, in the mountains, we see the ruins of forgotten people and abandoned watchtowers. To the north by the sea, we see even more of these. Likely, these were destroyed by ancient avalanches. The incredibly rare Pokemon Spiritomb can be found by these ruins, and it's said to contain angry spirits. Perhaps the angry spirits of the many people killed by this Pokemon. This too is also where the Ghost Gym is located, suggesting a large ghostly presence in the mountains. After being defeated, it was sealed away in the west next to a desert to keep it as far away from ice and snow as possible.
We also suspect that as well as Baxcalibur, Cerulege and Armarouge have a part to play in this story as the Pokemon used by these Pokemon wielders of old, or perhaps as the human incarnations of these Pokemon before they became the spirits that they are today. Whoever Cerulege was, or whichever user was using Cerulege, failed in their journey, as Cerulege is known for being a Pokemon spirit that didn't achieve its goals. However, you could imagine the cracking of Tinglu's vase, or perhaps even the snapping of Chien Pao's sword if it wasn't always in two parts, to be the result of the blade of a Cerulege. Armarouge, however, is a different story. Armarouge is a venerated hero of old. That golden armor seemed to have worked for the hero of that time. And this is reflected in actually the modern day Paldean currency, because, and this is where Gimmighoul comes back into it, those Gimmighoul coins on them have what looks to be the face of a Bronzor. And Bronzor has relevance to this story as well, because the ceramic of a Bronzor is what you use to create Armarouge's armor. For Cerulege, it's Sinisty pottery, but here it's the ceramic of a Bronzor, or the iron of a Bronzor, that helps make this armor. And maybe this armor was more successful in combating these Pokemon because it is an armor that comes from the east, with Bronzor being from Mount Coronet in Old Hisui. Now, the East is kind of a vague term in Pokemon. These Pokemon, of course, are described as being bought from a merchant from the East, and looking at their inspirations, you would expect them to come from some kind of China Pokemon region, although at this point in time, we don't actually have a China Pokemon region. China is mentioned in Pokemon directly by name in the old Arcanine Pokedex entries, but they were retconned later to suggest the East again, generally. But then even the Japanese regions have been called the East. Mali City Gardens is a result of Eastern influence, talking about Japan. And of course, both Japan and China are, relatively speaking, on a world map in the East. The thing is, that whole thing about Arcanine being a legendary Pokemon in the East/China, well, that might actually be a reference to Hisui now, with the noble Arcanine, or the ghostly one that seems to be immortal that just shows up partway through the story. So with that all in mind, if these areas are synonymous in the Pokemon world, or if they are just never going to make a China Pokemon region for whatever reason, then it isn't unreasonable to deduce that Wuchen, Qianpao, Tinglu, and Chiyu, yes, I got it again, are in fact from the Japanese Pokemon country, which contains Hisui, Kanto, Johto, the Sevi Islands, Hoenn, and the new DLC area, Kitakami.
Kitakami, the setting for the first pack of the DLC, is clearly inspired by an area of Japan just south of Hokkaido, which is the real-world inspiration for Hisui. This area features several heroic or legendary Pokemon that all look like they could be part Dark-type. Additionally, we are visiting Kitakami as part of an exchange program that may go back to the origin of the school 800 years ago, or even before then. But there is one more connection. The Hidden Treasures of Area Zero, the title of this DLC expansion. After all, the ruinous quartets are called the Treasures of Ruin. So there's that word again, treasure. And sure enough, in the hands of Ogerpon is a treasure that seems to have brought ruin to the Kitakami of old, the Terastallization Mask of Ogerpon. Perhaps this is a peace offering or a Trojan horse of sorts, given to the Kitakami people by the Paldean king, who loves treasures, and it's all part of his revenge for nearly ending the Paldean Empire halfway through its reign. But that remains to be seen.
The Mask is part 1 of the Hidden Treasure of Area Zero DLC for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and it takes us to the lands of Kitakami. This land is not a full-blown region, but seems to be a sub-area, kind of like the Isle of Armor or the Crown Tundra, that they were previously part of the Galar region. With Kitakami, it seems that this is abroad from Paldea, in an aesthetic that clearly seems to be Japanese. And we've seen Japanese culture in the Pokemon world before. Of course, the Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and Sinnoh regions, previously known as Hisui, are all inspired by various areas in Japan. It seems that the Pokemon world operates much like our world, except with the countries that they're part of broken up into these little sub-regions. In fact, it's dialogue in Heart Gold and Soul Silver that suggests that Kanto, Johto, and Sinnoh are all as part of the same country. We've also seen Japanese culture in the Isle of Armor, as well as actually in the Alola region in Marley City, but these seems to be reproductions of that culture, which is often referred to in the Pokemon world as just having an Eastern influence. In the case of the Isle of Armor, it was to build the Tower of Darkness and Waters to be like the original home of Kubfu, which is theorized to be Old Hisui. But Kitakami seems to be very clearly inspired by an area in Japan, specifically an area called Kitakami, similar to how the Kanto region in Pokemon is named after the Kanto region of Japan. So I think this is intentional, and I think this adds a lot of lore to the Japanese country that appears in the Pokemon world. I'd like to share what I've thought about with you, and how I actually think it's possible we've been to Kitakami before. So the real-life Kitakami is an area in Japan south of what would be known as Sinnoh in the Pokemon world and north of Johto and Kanto. And those of you who have been around for a while in the community will know that there's another similar add-on event for a main series Pokemon game in Heart Gold Soul Silver that allows you to travel to a very special location called Sinjo, somewhere between Sinnoh and Johto. And there, if you take an event Arceus with you, you'll be able to create a new Giratina, Dialga, or Palkia, and unlock an event learning more about the history of the Pokemon world from a special hiker. This special hiker also appears in the Canalive Library, the Orberg Mine, and as well as that in an area of Heart Gold Soul Silver called the Embedded Tower, where Groudon and Kyogre are locked away. This will become relevant later. Even though it would seem that this is some Gen 4 special side event stuff. What's that got to do with what's going on today? But Sinjo isn't just something of the past, it is also something that was being referenced just a year ago with the release of Pokemon Legends Arceus, because in that game we learn a lot about the old Sinnoh, or as it was known then, Hisui region. And back then, Hisui was being settled for the first time around about 200 years ago. While at this time people are traveling from all different regions to settle in Jubilife Village, before them there were the Celestica people, who are currently divided into the Diamond and Pearl clans elsewhere in the Hisui Savage Wilds. They themselves were once a single group of Celestica people called the Sinnoh people, and they worshipped what they believed to be called the Almighty Sinnoh, or in that case, Arceus. And as we look to the old verses that can be dug up across old Hisui, we learn more about the history of these people. We learn that the Sinnoh people were in fact born in a place called Sinjo, likely the Sinjo ruins, where the people of modern-day Hisui first learnt about Arceus. It's likely they travelled north in pursuit of this knowledge to discover Arceus. So who are they before they were the Sinnoh people, and what's this got to do with Kitakami? Well, the only way that we can know is to look at the only member of that original unified clan, Kogita, who lives in the ancient retreat that has been there since long before the Diamond and Pearl clan separated and settled. This retreat will one day become Celestic Village, but for now it is the home of her, the last of the original Sinnoh people. She talks a lot about time, and she's somewhat of a lorekeeper, and that suggests to me that their history might be in lorekeeping. Lorekeeper is a trainer class that we see in Generation 3 Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. There we have the Lorekeeper Zinnia, descendant of a 2,000-year-old dragon clan. They were removed from their home in Meteor Falls when the meteors fell down on it 2,000 years ago, and they began to nomadically travel. We see traces of them again in the Alola region in the Seafaring Seafolk Village, I think it's called? Yeah, Seafolk Village. We also see them all about the Hoenn region. We see their presence with the Regis. We also see the presence of these dragon clans all across the Pokemon world. Hassel seems to be part of some kind of dragon clan or cult. We also have Drasna of Generation 6, who is an Elite Four member also, who seems to have come from Celestic Town. And before all of that, back in Generation 2, there were the Dragon Clan of the Dragon's Den in the north of the Johto region. And if you look to the manga, you can specifically see that their leader wears a Rayquaza on their hat. And in fact, including in all of this, as I've mentioned previously, it seems that a lot of what these lorekeepers do is keep at bay legendary Pokemon and keep them sealed away. I've done a whole video about their connection to the Regis, both in the Hoenn region and, of course, Regigigas in Sinnoh, and I highly recommend that video. I loved making it. On top of all of this, their presence can be seen in the previously mentioned Embedded Tower, which shares a lot of similarities to the Sky Pillar, and this is where Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza are being sealed away. So, after the destruction of their home 2,000 years ago, they began to nomadically roam, and this included moving north, where eventually they would move through Johto, where the Dragon Clan are settled, and continued upwards to Sinjo, and I believe they also arrived in Kitakami, if they're not the exact same place. While at first Dragon Clans and Lorekeepers don't appear to be present in the Teal Mask DLC, what we do see is a lot of little elements of the DLC appearing in the same area of Hisui. Eduardo on Twitter, who I highly recommend you follow by the way, has pointed out that the outfit colorations that we see don't seem to be just random in this promotional art for the Teal Mask. The blue, the pink, and the green. The blue and the pink being references, of course, to the origins of the Diamond and Pearl clan shortly after they began to split and theorize that the almighty Sinnoh was a different thing. But as for the green, this is highly reflected in Kogita's base in the ancient retreat. When you look inside her tent, it's all green, a deep green, as if before they separated, they were unified as one clan and they wore this green coloration. It's possible that the green might also be a reference to Celebi if they really did travel up from Johto. After all, the ancient retreat will one day become Celestic Town, where there's a shrine similar to that of Celebi's from the Ilex Forest. The shrine could also be a reference to the forces of nature, because of course, Kogita is the one who wields the mighty Enamorus during the events of the Hisui story. And sure enough, in the Unova region, a shrine can be found that is very, very similar to the one in Celestic Town. But I digress, that's just one connection, because another connection is something else that appears in Kogita's hut, something that's a little bit out of place. You see, there is this unique model for this blue book in there, which looks an awful lot like the Violet book from Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Now, this book is at least 200 years old, and so too is the people of Hisui, so it seems like this will have come into possession for Kogita recently. But the book was circulating at the time of Pokemon Legends Arceus, and if you think it's just a big coincidence, this asset doesn't seem to appear anywhere else in the entire game, suggesting that there's a connection to the Paldea region in Hisui. If it came up from Kitakami, that's interesting because it seems that they have this foreign exchange program that happens year after year, suggesting this has been a regular thing going up back years, maybe even hundreds of years. The school is at least 800 years old, and this festival seems to be a focus on tradition. It also seems likely that the main Pokemon, the legendary of the Teal Mask, stole the power of Terastall from the Paldea region and brought it with them to the Kitakami region, and this can be seen by the Terra crystals that appear to be in its mask. Additionally, elsewhere on Twitter, Lightfield Ray seems to show us that much of the language that appears across the Hisui region seems to be present in the Kitakami region through the trailer, the DLC, the board that we see in the DLC. So the culture of the Kitakami region has entered Hisui at a very early time, suggesting that these two places are connected, or at least people who had traveled to the region had traveled through here. And that totally makes sense. But there is one final connection to suggest that the people of Hisui who had traveled from Sinjo at some point passed through the Kitakami region, and that is all in the form of masks. See, masks are a big part of the tradition of this area, with each of the hero Pokemon that appear in that area having their own mask, and of course the legendary Pokemon having its own mask too. But similarly in Hisui, there is a mask that is a special part of the game. It's not a huge part, but it is notable, and that is the baneful mask of Hisui and Zorua, which ties into the legends of the area. Now, the act of mask crafting alone might not mean much. However, we don't really see it much where else in the Pokemon world, and additionally, the pre-order bonus for the Teal Mask DLC is a Hisui and Zoroark. Coincidence? Maybe, but when you put all these things together, I'm not so sure. The Teal Mask is part 1 of the hidden treasures of Area 0 and shows us traveling to the land of Kitakami. Inspired by the real Japanese location Kitakami, the events of this DLC are happening abroad from Paldea. Wooper take on their traditional forms as seen in Sinnoh and Johto, and in fact the trailer is filled with Johto Pokemon. Additionally, there are statues of Hisui and Growlithe, and language matching that of old Hisui on signposts that lead us to believe that this land is south of the mystical Sinnoh region. This in line with the real world equivalents, and both Sinnoh and Kitakami have mountains at their center, with Sinnoh of course having Mount Cornet and Kitakami having a mountain with a face, potentially of a giant monster, possibly a Pokemon from the ancient past. But what is this creature? Have we seen it before?
We'll be breaking this down, and Toby and I do recommend that you check out this video on the connections between Hisui, Sinjo, and Kitakami. To briefly summarize it, we truly believe that the area we are visiting in the Teal Mask is an area south of Sinnoh, which we happen to know from Professor Oak's Pal Park dialogue dialogue is in the same country as Kanto, Johto, and Hoenn. Furthermore, there was once a nomadic group of Lorekeepers that traveled north of Johto and Hoenn to the land that back then was known as Hisui. These Dragon Masters and Lorekeepers were pursuing knowledge of Arceus and were leaving behind their language in the Tanobi ruins, the Salacion ruins, and of course, even in the ruins of Alph. Though any number of these clans are connected, the Kimono Girls, the Dragon Keepers, the Seafolk people, it seems that the core of this particular group were the Celestica people as described in Legends Arceus, and from which Kogita hails. If they traveled north from Johto or Sinjo, as stated in the old verses you can find in Legends Arceus, then it is very likely that they came through the area of Kitakami, and that means they very likely encountered this giant mountain that seems to have the face of an ogre or giant. It's even quite possible that they encountered Ogerpon himself.
Ogerpon is this DLC's central Pokemon, and while pon is a suffix of the word meaning cutesy or sweet, ogre is a very specific kind of word, multi-layered, like an onion. Ogres are European creatures of folklore said to grind your bones into bread.
Well, actually, that would be a giant. Ogres, oh, they're much worse. They are like onions.
Oh, of course, but giants and ogres are often conflated in media, and while its Japanese inspiration is clearly that of an Oni and Kitakami Oni Island, the connection to giants and ogres is not lost when we look to the mountain face. Clearly it's not made of a natural formation, but then it doesn't seem to be human crafted either, so then what exactly is this mountain head? And where does the ogre in Ogerpon's name come from? To get to the bottom and top of this, let's take a look at Gigantism in Pokemon.
Well, giants is a word that comes up in the mythos of Hisui, with the plates of Arceus referring to their creation as being the power of defeated giants infused into plates. And we do know that there certainly are giant Pokemon, and Eternatus and Gigantamax Pokemon were introduced just one generation ago. It even talks about in Gigantamax Melmetal's Dex entry how it is a Cyclopean giant. Titan, Totem, and Noble Pokemon are also a thing, with these all being Pokemon that outsize Pokemon of their respective species. These are due to Ultra Wormholes or Arceus or Herba Mystica respectively, and this just shows us that Pokemon infused with life energy can grow exponentially. Even in the anime, we've seen some truly tremendously big Pokemon, and then we do know that Pokemon will shrink down to fit inside their Pokeballs. Yet, with all of this size changing in the Pokemon world, we have never seen a Pokemon as giant as a mountain. But a Pokemon that seems to be this tall is mentioned once again in the Galar region.
A theory I was never truly able to materialize in the days of Sword and Shield was that of the Giant of Galar. The idea being that the whole region itself used to be a giant that fell into the sea long ago, with the giant's cap, seat, mirror, and foot being area names located across the wild area and the Crown Tundra. And at its foot, a giant Pokemon, Regigigas, sleeps at level 100. Regigigas, of course, being the king of the Regis, the legendary Titans, another form of giants in Pokemon. Regigigas has a Pokedex entry suggesting that it used to move the continents themselves, helping tow them and shape the earth. But what if before those continents were continents, they themselves were creatures like Pokemon from which the earth formed around? Imagine for a moment the idea that the regions of the Pokemon worlds and the mountaintops that they're formed around were themselves once giant colossal creatures bound to the earth. If this is the case, then perhaps Regigigas in a time long ago worked as minions of Arceus to rope and pull down these giants and infuse their powers then into the plates, building out the Pokemon world from on top of them. Though the text on the Arceus plates do read the word defeated, another word for this would be fallen. Perhaps they did fall into the sea after being defeated by the true power of Arceus, a Pokemon whose current Pokemon-like form is a form that Arceus has chosen, as learnt in Legends Arceus. Its true form being incomprehensible compared to the Pokemon that we train and keep as pets. If so, perhaps before the age of Pokemon, there were other creatures like this.
If this is true, then Regigigas would be on the foot of this giant, whose body and head run south to Kitakami, which would be south of the Coronet mountain range. You can even see how the Coronet mountain range goes south. This would mean that Mount Coronet is the spine of this giant, so Spear Pillar is sitting on top of the spine, and thus its feet would lie in Snow Point. This is also very similar to how we see in the Galar region and the Crown Tundra specifically, that Regigigas is found in the giant's foot. So it seemed these Regis helped Arceus tow these giants or continents with rope much like Luke Skywalker on Hoth.
Nice, and it makes sense that they towed the continents because they towed them because Regigigas is at their toes because they sleep at the feet of the giants. Still, back to the theory. It's possible that these fallen giants fell into the sea, creating the regions of the Pokemon world. This ties not only into the implied lore of the upcoming Terapagos, who represents the world turtle, a creature that carries the world on its back, nor just the lore of Paldea itself, a region that looks like it belongs on the back of a Terapagos, as you can see by its outline. But it also ties into what we know about rocks in the Pokemon world. From Megastones to Z-Crystals, Terra Shards to Wishing Stars, or from the Tundra to the ore of Hisui from which we make Pokeballs, all the way back to the stones of Pokemon Black and White. All across the history of the Pokemon world, geological mementos of each of the region have contained great energy that allows them to transform Pokemon into different variations, or of course amplify their powers. It's possible that once, before Ogerpon was what it was today, its energy came from the husk of a creature from a primordial time, before people and Pokemon existed. A time when only Arceus and the Regis of old helped shape the earth by felling these giant creatures. Regidrago has a Pokédex entry referring to the fact that it was made from crystallized dragon energy. Perhaps there was one of each of these giants for each type. If so, then we must wonder the role of each of these giants, including the one that Ogerpon calls home. If its back truly is where Spear Pillar is, then it must hold some special significance. Perhaps this was the first or the last of the giants that Arceus fell, and from here it would choose a spot on the giant's back to commune with the humans that would live eventually in this region.
This actually explains the Pokédex entry of Hisui and Typhlosion, which states, said to purify lost forsaken souls and guide them to the afterlife. I believe this form may have been influenced from the energy from the sacred mountain towering at Hisui's center. This would also explain how Rotom, a pretty technically advanced Pokemon, is able to exist in the Coronet Highlands naturally. The ghostly energy that creates life seemingly from nothing and created the mythical stones of the Pokemon world is all left over from the regions that were at one point very much alive themselves in an age before recorded history when these plates were being made. Of course, there is something else. By the time humans would arrive in Kitakami and see this mountain face, it would seem special, but by all accounts would just seem to be a giant Pokemon. As you move into the Senjo ruins just south of Kitakami, you will find these statues of Rhydon, or at least they look to be Rhydon. Statues like this date all the way back to Gen 1, but modern iterations of them seem to depict Pokemon that don't actually exist. The shape of Rhydon was also used to just be a representation of several bestial Pokemon in lieu of overworld sprites. Is it possible that as folks traveled back south to Johto, these carvings changed over time and just eventually people started thinking that they were supposed to be Rhydon, so they started carving Pokemon that looked more like Rhydon? Very similar to a game of telephone. This bit is admittedly much more speculative.
Of course, this is just part 1 of the hidden treasure of Area 0. Part 2 is the Indigo Disc, and me and Lumio's post have already done a video about that. Thank you. Part 2 of the hidden treasure of Area 0 is the Indigo Disc, and the land of the Indigo Disc has been found to be an artificial island in the ocean where a biome of Pokemon exists safely and out of danger. Above them, the Blueberry Academy. This concept is cool, but not new. Just a few generations ago, we first visited the Aether Paradise, and through dialogue in the game, we learned that it is a single branch, the Alolan branch of a much larger chain of scientific research areas. This too is an artificial island supporting people and Pokemon in a fake biome. The links between these two areas keep on going. This video is part 1 of 2 videos coming out this month, the first on the Indigo Disc and the second on the Teal Disc, and together they will reveal for you what the hidden treasure of Area 0 really is. Join me as we investigate the hidden treasure of Area 0, and for both of the upcoming videos, I'm going to be teaming up with Lumio's post.
Hey Toby, thanks for having me. So the Aether Paradise is a haven for Pokemon where Pokeballs will not work due to a jamming signal. This same type of jamming signal can appear in the Zero Lab, another Paradise-like location in Area 0. Here, only Professor Sada or Turo's Pokeballs will work. All other ones are blocked by a jamming signal. Additionally, Professor Sada and Turo, as you're fighting them at the end of the game, will start to lose control, and eventually something called the Paradise Protection Protocol takes over. And both of these locations, the Aether Paradise and Area 0, seem to be linked to a place in the Indigo Disc, the world beneath Blueberry Academy, the Terrarium. Like both aforementioned places, the Terrarium seems to have some kind of manipulated environment. Just like how we see with Area 0 that it is daytime all the time, doesn't matter when you go down there, we see manipulated environments, climates, weather, and even an artificial sky down in the terrarium. Also, the workers at the Ether Paradise, the researchers and professors over at Area 0, and even the staff of the Blueberry Academy all seem to be dressed in stark white.
We didn't actually know where the Paradise program and jamming signal tech originally came from in Scarlet and Violet, but the Blueberry Academy does now seem like a likely suspect, with the technology being shared similarly to the Aether Foundation. There's another link too. We know that Sada and Churro knew Clavel, the head of the Academy of Scarlet and Violet, and they together worked on the Terra Orbs, which seems to share Terapagos' power. It has on the front the little hexagon shape that has the eyes, not too dissimilar to Liko from the anime, who has the hexagon from which Terapagos lives within. This means that Clavel has some knowledge of Terapagos' power, at least in some way or another. And Clavel is an acquaintance of Syrano. Syrano is the head of the Blueberry Academy and its founder, and he is dressed all in white and blue, and his scarf, as many have noticed, bears the symbol of Honed, Doublade, and Aegislash, a Pokemon of importance. Because Aegislash are the Pokemon of kings, and dead kings specifically. Pokédex entries such as in X and Y state that generations of kings are attended by these Pokemon, which use their spectral power to manipulate and control people and Pokemon. As the principal and founder of the Academy, that lines up, with Syrano being a king or a leader. It's either literal or metaphorical that he is the king, but this idea ties in with the real-world inspirations for the Blueberry Academy. The idea of a fantastically, technologically advanced civilization with powers beyond that of the modern day out at sea is evocative of Atlantis. First written about by the Greek philosopher Plato, Atlantis straddles the line between fact and fiction, much like the paradox Pokemon of Scarlet and Violet. Atlantis, though, in fiction is often depicted as a civilization with highly advanced technology. Usually it is this technology that leads the people of Atlantis to succumb to hubris, allowing that very technology to be their downfall. So if the Blueberry Academy is Atlantis, and the power of the terrarium and terrestrial Pokemon is the advanced technology, more advanced than the rest of the Pokemon world, then of course, Syrano is the king of Atlantis, who, in mythology, was Atlas, the son of the sea god Poseidon. Atlas is depicted, always, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Quite literally speaking, he carries the world in his hands, not too dissimilar from the mythos of the world turtle that carries the world on its back. This, of course, being the real-world inspiration for Terapagos. So if Terapagos is the world turtle and Syrano is Atlas, then together the weight of the world is on their shoulders. They carry the world on their back. Terapagos is in the possession of Syrano.
Something I notice is that Syrano may take inspiration from Baobab, who was the Safari Zone guy back in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which of course the Safari Zone there was another artificial conservation area for rare Pokemon. But protecting rare Pokemon may not be all that Syrano has on his mind. Coming back in lore, everything tells us that Syrano reigns from a long line of kings and powerful people. Aegislash's Pokédex entry in Sword talks about a king of Galar. Once upon a time, a king with an Aegislash reigned over the land. Over time, this Pokemon eventually drained him of his life, and his kingdom fell with him. In Paldea, we know about another king whose reign was brought to ruin. And Syrano clearly has some Kalos origins here. Kalos is another region that fell apart due to a great war. In fact, the real-life Syrano du Bergerac, was famous for helping to stop a plot to overthrow King Louis XIII. Now, some of you may already know this, but King Louis XIII is actually the real-world inspiration for AZ. So perhaps Syrano is one of AZ's allies. No matter the case, this connection with Atlantis and Aegislash seems to suggest that the Blueberry Academy is doomed to fall, likely due to the hubris of these mortals messing around with godly Pokemon that they seem to think they can control, but definitely can't. This often is the fate of villainous people in the Pokemon world, like Maxie and Archie and Getsis, and most recently, even Chairman Rose. Many of you will already be familiar with Toby's theory that the 4 parts of Arceus are light, poison, life, and reflective, but you can check the video in the top corner to learn more about this. So Terapagos' power is likely godly and being used by Syrano to create this artificial world beneath Blueberry Academy. You even see these blocks that he's using to likely manipulate the climate here, and these undeniably look like they are carved from rocks that can be found in Area Zero.
The DLC, of course, is the hidden treasure of Area Zero, suggesting that Area Zero's treasure may have been taken out to sea to create this new empire after the ruin of the old one and the unification of Paldea. You could say that Syrano has taken the crown or crown jewels, quite literally, with the Terra Crown and its jewels' power coming from Terapagos. And while building his new world in the ocean, Syrano has been using the eyes of Terapagos, likely with the help of Clavel, to see everything that's been going on in Paldea, possibly spying on the region for a long time. He is monitoring the trainers of the region, possibly to help with the creation of his battle academy to see how their battles go, but also possibly to keep eyes on Area Zero, to stop researchers like Sada and Churro from getting too close to the truth. He wouldn't want them to discover what he already discovered in Area Zero. The name Area Zero implies the existence of other numbered areas. Perhaps then the terrarium is Area 1, the first true utopia based on what was found down there. So where does that leave us? We have our Atlantis area in Pokemon, led by the descendants of a great royal line. Definitely Syrano has Terapagos in his control, as referenced by both of their shared relationship to, of course, the World Turtle and Atlas. Their shared color blue also is a big hint. He is likely using the power of Terapagos to shape this biome underground to be a paradise. This is actually directly referencing the fact that the terrarium has an artificial sky even though it's underwater. So too does Area Zero. Notice that it's always daytime down there. He has probably had help from other organizations like the Aether Paradise and perhaps swapped technologies with them to learn more. Possibly even helping them create the RKS system for Silvally. After all, Terapagos is the Pokemon with all of the types. Perhaps he's also been researching Pokemon behavior through connections in the various safari zones of the Pokemon world, where Pokemon can be free outside of Pokeballs, and of course he created the Pokeball jamming signal, and the Paradise Protection Protocol, all to stop the kids of Scarlet and Violet, meddling people such as yourself, from coming in and learning too much about the hidden treasure of Area Zero. I believe that the game's true villain and keeper of secrets is the one and only Syrano, and much like other villainous leaders in history, and the history of Atlantis, this Blueberry Academy leader is doomed to fall at your hands. Okay, forget about Unova remakes. I'm going to give you the lore reason, the canon reason that the Blueberry Academy is set in the Unova region. I was in the Unova region, New York, last week. This time last week, hanging out with Dusty Gogoat from the Hidden Power podcast. We recorded a podcast episode out there, which is live now. You can check that out, link in the description. And while the cameras were rolling, I said, Dusty, I've got an idea for a theory here. I think I've worked out exactly why the Blueberry Academy is in Unova. And then you will be hearing now, exactly as he did, live for the first time, exactly what this theory is, and it makes way too much sense. I'm so excited about this. All right, you can't look at this. You can't.
Okay. I have no idea what he's gonna say.
Here we go. So, first thing is first.
Okay.
The Indigo disc is confirmed to be in the Nova region.
Yes. That's a correct. Yes.
Okay.
That's right.
Full stop. Done. Video's over. Good work. We did it.
All right. I'll see you guys.
We did it.
Where's my pizza?
I sort of said before I went for my nap that there's this idea that the character of Lacey, who's going to be quite important, might be a granddaughter of or daughter of the gym leader Clay in Driftvale City, because she's got the
she's got pink hair. She has diamonds in her hair.
Right.
They're berets.
Mm-hmm. And Clay's got the big diamond on his cowboy hat. And
that's his whole thing.
The reason I think that Lacey might be there as a member of the school is a form of nepotism, because we also see Drayton, who is probably the grandson or son of Drayden.
And in the original Unova games, we have, what's his name, Benga
right.
is the son of Alder, who maybe isn't receiving nepotism preference, but he is a very skilled trainer.
Right.
He's had that ability.
It seems like these legacy, like gym leader children, maybe they're all going somewhere to get educated, and maybe that's the Indigo Disc Academy. So that's the first little part of this, I guess. Lacey also, I think, I saw in Hoops' recent video, is an anagram of Clay, which is
really cool.
Clay, Lacy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's an anagram. So it's really interesting. So there might be a connection there. But I also think it makes sense for Clay because it's come up recently. You might have seen this on Twitter. There's the gemstones.
Yes.
That Clay will have mined out of the Driftvale mines that look like the Terra crystals.
Yeah, and they're in a museum in the original Unova games.
Right. And in the Indigo Disc, it seems clear that the Terra Crystals have been used to sort of form the terrarium. Like, so clearly there's been, like, Clay has worked on the Indigo Disc.
Yeah.
And if you're following the real world release dates, that means the Indigo Disc probably became an academy about 10 years ago in terms of the Pokemon lore, about when Black and White 2 ended. Okay. With me so far, on board, this is all fine.
So far.
So here's the next, this is like a different theory, but it ties in. The Pokemon World Tournament is in Driftvale City.
Yes.
Driftvale City between Black and White 1 and 2 sees a lot of industrial development, likely as a result of Clay's work, but I think collaborating with Syrano. And there's always been a bit of a mystery about the Pokemon World Tournament. And you already know where I'm going with this little bit.
Yeah, I do know,
What am I going to say? Go on. You tell them, because I'm going to say the rest.
Should I just, like, spoil it?
Spoil it, go for it.
The trainers that you fight in the Pokemon World Tournament are AI. Why would Giovanni be there?
Right.
Right? Why?
Red is down from Mount Silver.
Yeah.
All the gym leaders from all over the world.
And it would make sense if that happened like once in a while, if it was like you could only do it on Fridays. That could make sense because people come in, right? They
come in for the tournament.
But you can play it back to back to back to back.
So all these gym leaders, and most people...
always present, omnipresent, and I'll add something. They actually don't... The trainers you fight at the Pokemon World Tournament, they will actually have different teams than whatever their teams are throughout the rest of the region, right?
So, and this idea of AI technology, I think previously people would just go, oh, it's just the Pokemon World Tournament. Like, they're not really
Which is
there.
honestly what I've always thought.
It's not really canon. But for every other battle facility, like, you look at, like, the Pokemon tree in Alola, you go,
there's a limit, right? There's a limit to who can actually show up there, right?
100%.
Which we've had an issue with as fans, but canonically, it probably makes sense.
But now we know AI is a thing with Sada and Chura. Sada and Churro in Area Zero.
Thing. The trainers that you fight in the World Tournament, they are unchanged from wherever they existed.
Whatever point in time,
right? Where the people in the battle tree, Red and Blue, have aged up. Who is it?
Right.
The other person has aged up.
All of the other Jimmies. Okay, so far we've got that. This idea that they're AI, but why would Driftvale City, of all places, have access to AI technology? Well, if they're working with the Blueberry Academy, now we got to remember the Blueberry Academy is a sister academy to the, I'm going to say them wrong, the Academy of Scarlet and Violet.
I'm not going to say
no.
it.
Okay. But what's interesting is that the academies in Scarlet and Violet are 800 years old. Blueberry Academy probably isn't older than Black and White 2. It's probably not only 10 years old. So in what way are they sister academies? Well, I think that Syrano worked with the original Sada and Churro in Area Zero, or in excavating Area Zero, taking research notebooks. Now, in Area Zero, there are these folders that are all blue, that all the notes are in. So I think Syrano, who I believe has Terapagos, we'll see when the DLC comes out, that doesn't really matter too much, but I believe that he was helping Sada and Churro in their investigation into Area Zero and the time machine so that he could build out the Blueberry Academy. But where this really hits ahead, and this is really, really fun, Area Zero, Syrano, is... there is actually another time machine. Well, there's two. There's the time capsule, but there's a time machine in Pokemon Black and White. Do you know about this?
No.
I
don't believe it.
There is.
Where?
There's an NPC, a time machine, but they need a Pokemon with the move Charge from the opposite game, which is really interesting. So most people do like Blitzle, they give it Charge and they trade it over. But what's really fascinating about that is the place that this scientist is located is in Opelucid City. The one city that is either set in the future or the past, depending on the version you play, suggesting it's a paradoxical location, which means there's a time machine in a paradox location in Pokemon Black and White.
How did you think of this?
That is, and so now we know how Syrano may have helped Sada and Churro in creating their time machine, but there's one last point to this.
What is it?
Do you know what you get for helping this scientist? There's an item in the game that you get.
Is it a key item or a regular item?
A regular item. It's a battle item that you get for helping the scientist in doing this.
A battle item or a TM?
It's like a battle item. Any ideas?
I'm gonna guess...
someone in the comments knows.
Leftovers.
It's not. It's the cell battery, right?
Oh, wow.
Now this is... so for some reason, this cell battery is part of making a time machine.
That would match up with Charge.
Yeah. Okay. Now there's one other place in the game you can get a cell battery. Do you know where that is?
Pokemon World Tournament?
The Battle Subway.
Oh.
Who's in the Battle Subway?
Ingo and Emmett.
Who has recently had time travel shenanigans. So what if Ingo didn't actually come through a space-time distortion like we think? What if he was the result of cell batteries being given to this scientist trying to make a time machine and gets warped back in time to the world of Legends Arceus through that time machine? And that's why there are this guy has cell batteries to give.
That's crazy.
After the events of Black and White 2, in perfecting the time machine and collecting more cell batteries, this scientist accidentally warps Ingo into the past.
That's crazy.
But gives Syrano, who's running the new Blueberry Academy, the information he needs to perfect the time machine for Sada and Churro. He also helps Sada and Churro create their AI counterparts, and that's why the notebooks are blue in Area Zero. And with that knowledge, helps Clay in developing the Pokemon World Tournament. And Clay is helping him make the Indigo
It's all
disc.
coming together. It's literally all coming together.
There's so many little points here. So I don't know. I'm pretty impressed with myself.
That's really good. That's really good.
I want to know what people think in the comments.
For
what are
me,
you feeling?
the thing that's really interesting to me, because like what we're discussing today is like, what is the possibility of a Gen 5 remake? All these little things, especially those two different towns, Opelousas City, that swap, right? It would be interesting to explore a new set of Unova games that have these like paradox elements, right? Where two different regions are almost existing at the same time, depending on whatever.
Well, you've got in Black and White 2, there's a whole bunch of new areas. There's in Black and White 1, there's the White Tree Hollow and the Black Tower in Black City, and like, I think we could if the Paradox Pokemon is that idea localized to Pokemon, and the Indigo Disc is a world where perhaps we might see elements of the past and future collide, a Unova remake could surely see many of the towns of Unova in a state of sort of a paradoxical
I'm curious.
flux.
I want to look back to see what other things that the scientists have said in these different games, because they're always, whatever the scientists say, I'm like convinced that's what Game Freak is thinking. They go, wouldn't it be cool if this happened in a future game?
Well, you know, it's,
and they tuck it into some
it's
NPC
not even
dialogue.
speculation. Do you know why?
Because it keeps happening.
It keeps
There's
happening.
so much evidence.
It happened in Generation 3.
Yep.
There's a scientist in the Devon Corporation who says, I'm working on a machine that allows us to see into the world of Pokemon dreams. And sure
then
enough,
that's
in
what
Black and
Gen
White,
5 is.
we literally get it.
But there's been other, I can't think of them right now, but those things exist.
Yeah.
Incredible, Toby. Well,
thank you.
I'm having fun in New York City.
Me too.
Unova's been good.
This has been good. Thank you
Yeah.
for doing this. Hey Pokemon Masters, Birdkeeper Toby here, and I have just woken up, but I saw something on Twitter that I had to jump into the Indigo Disc to find, and I'm blown away. It's a very cool theory. So first thing this morning, I looked at Twitter, I saw this image, I found it in-game, and this is an image on the wall of the Blueberry Academy's, like the hangout room that you can customize. And it turns out if you customize the room with a modern monochrome feel, you get this image. And this, for those of you who are still not sure, you're looking at it and you're unsure, this is the White Tree Hollow and the Black Tower from Pokemon Black and White, but it's more than just an Easter egg. There's lore here. So, these areas are obviously exclusive to Pokemon Black version for the Black Tower and Pokemon, the White Tree Hollow for the Pokemon White version. They're the same area in-game, but obviously just depending on the version, you get a different one. The idea being that in one version of reality, you have a metropolis-like city, and in another version of reality, nature has taken over and you can catch mystical Pokemon there. So here's the question. Why are both in this game? Canonically, what does the Indigo Disc follow on from? We know that it's in the Unova region, sure, but which Unova region? The one we saw in Pokemon Black or the one we saw in Pokemon White? It's not just an Easter egg. You see, and I was talking about this in a theory I did with Dusty Go-Go when I went out to the Unova region myself. I went to New York, I met up with Dusty Go-Go. We had a chat about this idea that Unova has a couple towns like this, one of which is Opelousas City, which is the one where obviously Drayton is from. This is a cool room, by the way. Look at that, you got your Unovan bridges, and you've got your like little crag and all hangy thing. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. Drayton, obviously, from Opelousas City. Opelousas City also has like a past version and a future version, depending on what version of the game you're playing. In fact, let me get my DS. Haven't had to get this capture card out in a while. Okay, all right. Oh yeah, okay, this is the good stuff. This is the good stuff. Pokemon White version, boot it up. If we fly to Opelousas, so in White version, for me, it is the past version, but obviously if I was playing Pokemon Black, it would be the future version. And there's a house somewhere here, a very important house, that has a very important someone in it. Wait, Drayton's house. I wonder if Drayton's in here. There's no way, because this would be set, I reckon, a good, like, decade before... this would be set a good decade before the events of the Blueberry Academy. Any of these guys look like Drayton? You look like Drayton? Are you Drayton? If you're Drayton, that was very rude. I'm not concerned about my Pokemon weight. My Emboar is beautiful, thank you. Focus, Toby. This is why we don't do theories first thing in the morning. Right. The house. Oh, it's gotta be this one. This is literally the last house in the entire town that I'm checking. I did this not that long ago. Okay, is it you? I want to know the future. Here we go. I want to know the future. I'm very worried. This guy, he wants to know the future. He's worried. Typical stuff. I wonder how my child, time, will spend their future. Time. So I'm making a machine that connects the future and the present. It's a time machine. But electricity is desperately short. I've heard that in another world, there's an Opelucid city that looks very futuristic. If there's a Pokemon from that world that knows to move charge, the machine may work. And if you, I don't have that Pokemon with me at the moment, but if you have a Pokemon like Blitzel, for example, is probably the one you're going to go for. From Pokemon Black version, you trade over and you get the Cell Battery item, which is a battle item. And he makes a time machine. Interesting as well is that you probably will do it with a Blitzel, and I'm pretty sure Syrano gives you a shiny Blitzel as like a default thing you can get here in the Indigo disc. So all very interesting stuff, but what does it all mean? Well, I think in large part it's all to do with this guy. It's all to do with Syrano, who's very suspicious. So he's the founder of the Blueberry Academy, right? And the Blueberry Academy is, according to the various Pokemon materials, a sister site to the academies of Scarlet and Violet. Except what's interesting is, like I say, this terrarium didn't exist in the time of Black and White and Black and White 2. It's probably not older than, say, 10 years. I think in terms of the in-game timeline, it's been around 10 years since Black and White 2's release, and that times up with the release of, like, the year in world that Black and White 2 happened, and that now these events are happening. So this terrarium is probably not over a decade old, and that makes sense as well, because you've got, like, Lacey is Clay's daughter, and that's interesting as well, because in Driftveil, there are these gems that look like Terastal gems, and on Lacey's team, there is Excadrill, which is obviously not only Clay's ace Pokemon, and Clay, Lacey, L-A-C-Y, but also her Excadrill. If you look at the Pokedex for Excadrill, the Pokedex entry for Excadrill says that it's good at making tunnels, and this whole dome is underwater, and in the Unova region, I'll just go there. Here we go. We have connecting Undella Town, Undella Bay, and Himmelao City, we have the Marine Tube, made with cutting-edge Unovan technology. So I suspect that this tunnel was made by the likes of, like, Clay and Driftveil, and as payment for that, they get the Pokemon World Tournament with all these powerful trainers in Driftveil City, and all of this is a sort of demo, a setup to prepare for the Indigo disc being built, the Blueberry Academy. But okay, what about the other bits of the terrarium, the bits that Syrano knows about, like the weird Terapagos orb at the top of the terrarium? Like, okay, how do we explain that thing? How did Syrano know to get the materials to make this, which ultimately allows for the entire dome to exist, for the climate to be adjusted, these cubes that are all over the map that kind of help the terrarium happen and help life sustain under here? How did Syrano know about the digging, the technology to get this dome in place? That was with the help of the people of Driftveil and likely Clay, and probably a good reason as to why Lacey is at this school. But what about the dome? What about this technology, the technology of Terapagos? And this is where everything kind of comes together with the different versions of Unova and the guy making the time machine in Unova. I believe that Syrano offered help to Sada and Churro in their expeditions in Area Zero and in creating the time machine based on what he knew from the Unova region of time machine creation and parallel universe and alternate timelines. Remember, we now know that the Paradox Pokemon come from alternate timelines, like the Black City and the White Tree Hollow. I believe that the reason that Sada and Churro were able to begin that research and learn that research is because they were being funded and helped out by Syrano. Actually, I don't even think that's a theory. I think that's just part of the lore. I think it's mentioned in passing in the DLC. The Blueberry Academy is only like a decade old. The academies of Scarlet and Violet are 800, and yet they're considered sister sites. We know that obviously Clavel and Syrano know each other very, very well. And as we explore the research stations in Area Zero, in blue notebooks, I might add, blueberry blue notebooks, my prototype Terra Orb I secured, thanks to my prototype Terra Orb, I secured corporate funding for my research and made a laboratory in the lighthouse near the Cabo Poco, to someday though I'll return to the creator and resume to study these crystals. So the Terra Orb, which is, I mean, I think effectively the thing at the top of the terrarium is a giant Terra Orb, sort of. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's similar technologies, but it's the Terra Orb that convinced Syrano that, brilliant, I'll work with Sada and Churro because what they might be able to provide the terrarium is the kind of fuel that makes everything run. And so in return, he was able to fund this project and provide research data. I'll also just note here that the Terra Orb was completed around 10 years ago with the help of Professor Clavel as well. So Clavel knows Syrano. Syrano would have started building the Indigo Disc around 10 years ago after the events of Black and White 2, so the timeline lines up. And one of the first things we learn in the Indigo Disc is that it cost him a lot of money to make. So he was a financial backer for something for the technological production of this Indigo Disc. So there you go. He's the perfect research partner for a freaking time machine because Unova already has a pretty good understanding. Somehow, someone in Unova has a pretty good understanding of time machines and alternate timelines. In fact, they know it so well that it's literally taught at the Blueberry Academy, where the art class are like, yeah, we'll add that as your decor just casually, even though it is literally showing you that alternate timelines exist. It would be so cool if I went to Opalicid City and there was a character that did something, like an NPC that was just like, I want to build a school. I just had a crazy idea. There's a guy in the marine tunnel who says that the way that they built the marine tunnel is things like that are built on land and then lowered into the sea. And I was just like, so I wonder if that was the case for the Indigo Disc. And then I was like, well, hang on. Didn't the cold storage area kind of be wasn't that like a construction area in Black and White? Wait, what if they were constructing the Pokemon World Tournament only temporarily? What if the Pokemon World Tournament area becomes the Blueberry Academy and then they lower it into the sea and it becomes the Indigo Disc? But I'm not sure on that now. There's not enough evidence for it. Trust me, I've spent the last 30 minutes off recording trying to find something. Though the currency of the Blueberry Academy is BP, and you get BP from the Pokemon World Tournament, and you know, it is a battle facility for the toughest trainers, which is exactly what this is. Maybe it really was only a temporary thing. Maybe they were building it initially on land, and then once it got big enough, it became the Blueberry Academy, and they took it offshore. Wild. Imagine if that was I'd love to see some evidence for that. Maybe you'll find it. You can let me know in the comments. That's the theory. That's my first thing this morning. I got more videos coming on the Indigo Disc. I'm working very, very hard. By the way, none of these videos count towards the kind of 6 final videos that I've got coming up. These are all just bonuses because the Indigo Disc has got me excited. So let me know what you're thinking in the comments. And of course, while you're down there, hey, Pokemon Masters, Bucky here, and we all know Charmander is a fire type until it evolves and it gains the flying type. Until it evolves again into Mega Evolution and gets the dragon type. Perhaps it terastallizes to get dragon? Oh wait, what if it's in the card game and it gets the lightning type? Yeah, not electric type, it's lightning in the TCG. Huh, and this is not a Charizard phenomenon. Pokemon swap types all the time. So how exactly does that work? And I don't mean like mechanically in terms of the game, I mean in the lore. How is it that Pokemon change types? Understanding how a Pokemon can change its type relies on us understanding what exactly a type is. And Pokemon lore has always been relatively vague. I think we've decided that it's a sort of classification system given by humans assigned to Pokemon. Except that's not quite true. Because while yes, scientists have agreed since the beginning of time that Charmander is a fire type because look at its tail, it's obviously fire, they can change their mind. And when new types are discovered, as in the Steel, Dark, and Fairy type later down the line, scientists can change their mind. You know what? Magnemite was always a steel type. So types are both labels that humans use to describe various attributes of Pokemon, but what attributes specifically, we don't really know. It's describing the presence of that energy within the Pokemon, and those energy, as they're depicted in the card game, are a lot more varied than the ones that appear in the card game. In the card game, they actually go under different names. While water and fire are the same, you've got Leaf, you've got the fighting energy, which represents all ground and rock Pokemon. Leaf represents, or it used to represent poison, but then they changed it so that psychic energy represented poison, and then they changed it again so that darkness energy represented poison. You've also got the metal type instead of the steel type. Or why the distinction? I don't really know, given that the only type that metal represents is steel type Pokemon anyway. There's no other regular type from the game that goes under that umbrella. So anyway, these are all types of energy, and it is believed, I think, widely by the Pokemon theorizing community that these forms of energy, these attributes, they all, if they were all coming together, would create infinity energy, the life force of a Pokemon. And these energy types are just different sort of expressions of that, but it's also somehow coded into the Pokemon's DNA. When Charmander reproduces, it doesn't reproduce into a water type Charmander, it typically reproduces into another fire type. unless you're talking about in a different region where there's a regional variant. Breed a Jotonian Wooper in the Paldea region, you'll get a Paldean Wooper because it was born in the Paldea region and it has a different types. So habitat and external influences can also affect a Pokemon's DNA and type, and even what regional form it's going to end up being when it reproduces. On top of that, there are Pokemon that can just change type naturally. Take, for example, Greninja with the Protean ability. It has the ability to kind of shapeshift based on the last move it used into the various different types. And speaking of that, what about moves? Plenty of Pokemon can use moves of Pokemon from other types. In Generation 3, Charmander knows Metal Claw, but that doesn't make it a Steel type. So it seems then, while Pokemon can have one or two kind of dominant overarching types that are consistent across their species, allowing us to define them by those types, Pokemon also have access to the other elements of Infinity Energy. Charmander can use Metal Claw, Rhydon can use Surf, and Pokemon like Greninja or Kecleon, which has the color change ability, changing its type when it's hit by a different type, other than its regular normal, can somehow alter the DNA as it ingests that energy or it takes advantage of the energy type it's using. By the way, quick little pause here. I love delving into the kind of the science and the biology of Pokemon, especially when it's all like, it doesn't require me to have a biology degree. It just allows me to delve deep into fiction. It's part of why I like the Evolution Tree series, which, by the way, the latest video on that is out. And also, if you are interested in getting a copy of the Evolutionary Tree for yourself or for a friend, maybe as a gift for the holidays or just because you'd enjoy it, click the link at the top of the description. We've put a lot of work in. Thanks very much. It's all of these Pokemon as if they lived on a tree of evolution, and that's another thing. Just having the same type as another Pokemon doesn't necessarily mean you're related biologically speaking. Like, Greninja is definitely closer related to the likes of Kecleon, probably because of its ability to change types rather than because of its type. You wouldn't say that a Greninja is closely related to a Wailord, with one being an amphibian and one being a mammal. Type is not a defining factor in how the tree of evolution is spread out. These are rather attributes that Pokemon have access to that make them Pokemon. In fact, that might be the defining trait that makes a Pokemon and not a regular animal. It's true too that possibly people can sometimes tap into this, with psychic trainer classes tapping into psychic energy, but never truly are they able to become the psychic type. We also of course see Terastal Pokemon, which is kind of the reason I'm doing this whole video. Like, how can we ignore the fact that Terastal allows a Pokemon to just change its type? Not something we've seen done so freely in the past. Well, I believe it's because the source of terastallizing energy is to do with this kind of third legendary Pokemon hidden in the subtext, I mean literally in the text, of Scarlet and Violet. In the Scarlet and Violet book, you can see the image of a Pokemon that seems to have some kind of connection to the energy that creates Terastal Pokemon, and I suspect this Pokemon to be similar to kind of Eternatus and Zygarde and Ultra Necrozma, and how all these Pokemon are kind of parts of, I guess, Arceus, or the Arceus, which is the godly energy. I've done a theory on that. You can check that out here. All that is to say that this legendary Pokemon clearly has some huge attachment to the variation of types and is able to manipulate, use its energy, and use the Terastal crystals to adjust the type of the Pokemon using its power, borrowing its power of changing types. I actually wonder if this Pokemon will have a Protean-like ability, allowing it to access all of the different types. Crystals and type changing, we've seen it before. We've seen it, and again, I must refer to the Pokemon trading card game, where we see, and I know many of you are going to go, Delta Pokemon? Yeah, Delta Pokemon, where Pokemon mostly gained the Metal type, actually, largely across the board, they gained the Metal type. I assume this has something to do with Metal energy just being easier to print. But also, Pokemon would change types wildly, like we've got this Electric Metal type Charizard, but before that even, Crystal Pokemon. Pokemon that didn't have the regular energy type and instead would use energies from other energy types different to it to power up their attacks. So the power of certain crystals have the ability to alter the types of Pokemon. It is interesting to note that, of course, the Crystal Onix is thought to be a different type to regular Onix, and in the third Pokemon movie, the Unknown, who creates stuff from imagination rather than biologically speaking, are able to create an Entei. Yes, they create the Entei using, well, we assume it's the regular Fire type, but actually it uses this incredible Shadow Ball-like move that we've not seen any other Entei use. I wonder, is this Entei able to access any type? Because it is made from a crystal structure that is made from the imagination of someone. I wonder if the Unknown, who we know from the Sinjar Ruins events, are like tied to Arceus in creation. And also, when it comes to creation, by the way, all of these Pokemon are created alongside big crystals. Dialga, Palkia, Giratina, they all got big gemstones, which I kind of did a theory on that already as well. But I do wonder if crystals in the Pokemon world somehow resonate in with the Pokemon's biological side and are able to manipulate the energy that they have access to. And I think this is proven in those Delta species cards, because there's actually lore behind these few sets. One of which is called Crystal Guardians, because Because yes, on the island of Holon, there are giant crystals everywhere that don't look too dissimilar to raid dens. And it seems that the researchers were hunting Mew, of course a Pokemon that has the DNA of all Pokemon and thus all Pokemon types living inside it. And they used some kind of electromagnetic wave, which not only messed with Mew, but messed with the entire island of Holon and changed all of the Pokemon on the island to the various types that we see in the Delta species arc. I wonder if it is a combination of both the biology of the Pokemon being affected by the result of this electromagnetic wave, so there is a genetic component, but the genetic component is what allows these creatures to access these types. These types are what make them Pokemon, and by altering that, you alter the energy that is the most prominent in their body. So for the first time, we're seeing electric type Charmanders, for example. And terastallizing, it's probably working in much the same way. Let me know what you're thinking in the comments down below. This is a really interesting topic for me. I really love this, but this is just kind of how I think about Pokemon types, and maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. Pokemon Masters, Bootstrap Toby here, and this is just a short little theory video. Tauros got not one, not two, but 3 new regional forms. It's got the kind of regular one, and then it's got a more uncommon Scarlet and Violet one, which one is like a fire type and one is water type. But what if I told you Tauros already had another regional form? Quickly, what is a regional form? Well, a regional form is a form that appears in another region, and I guess it shows the diversification of life, how a Pokemon living in one area or in one environment can start to look different from its original version. Tauros, though, has 3 different versions living in the same region, which tells me that Tauros actually has always had another regional form. You've seen the thumbnail, you know what it is. It's Miltank. Miltank is a Pokemon that, according to the Alolan Pokédex, is part of the same sort of, I guess, family as Tauros. We know this because when you look at the Alolan Pokédex, every Pokemon is grouped by either being an individual, part of an evolutionary family, or part of a legendary group like the Tapus, which are all obviously related. And then there are 2 other sets of Pokemon that look to be related, that are on the same Pokédex page. Those are Passimian and Oranguru, which are version-exclusive kind of versions of each other, and probably are related. I mean, just look at them. And Tauros and Miltank. Tauros and Miltank have always thought to be opposite versions of each other, with Tauros always being male and Miltank always being female. But what does this mean? Well, much how regional variants can be different types, perhaps regional variants can be different genders. We know that multiple regional variants of Tauros can all live in the same region. These are 3 Paldean Tauros, but they're all completely different. There is actually only 2 other regions where Miltank appears naturally, that being Johto and then the Kalos region. Other than that, I think it only appears through like Pokeradar and Safari Zones and that kind of thing, which Safari Zone, you know, that's where you find Tauros in Gen 1. Saying I think there's a lot of connections there. I believe the true first regional form may in fact be a regional Tauros, known as Miltank, that is available in Johto. That once upon a time probably wasn't called Miltank. It was probably called Jotonian or maybe Colosian Tauros. And that is why these otherwise seemingly unrelated Pokemon share a Pokedex page together. Because Tauros is a Pokemon that is known in other regions of the world to have multiple regional forms of itself in the same region. Hey Pokemon Masters, Bootstrap here, and this is a very short video about Kirlia, a Pokemon that knows its own morbid, dark future. Kirlia, a Pokemon that according to its own Pokédex entries can see into the future. It's not the only Pokemon that can do this. Other psychic Pokemon like Xatu can do this. Gothitelle gazes beyond the stars according to its new Violet Pokédex entry, seeing into the future. Oh, that's a really nice, helpful skill. Except wait, isn't the future of the Pokemon world now looking a little dark? A little like the singularity is here and the iron future Pokemon have taken over. Pokemon are becoming AI. Are they man-made now? Or is it the biology of the Pokemon evolved into an armored suit? Or perhaps these automatron creatures have the DNA of the Pokemon somewhere in there? I think more likely they've been programmed to just look into their soulless eyes. If that's the case, it means that the future for all Kirlia looks an awful lot like this. This is the Iron Valiant, described by novelty comic book magazine covers as just being a mere work of fiction. But no, this truthfully is the future for all Kirlia. I understand why the scientists of the Pokemon world would want a giant robotic Donphan. After all, it's the kind of Pokemon that could really help them in the field of battle, wading war and rolling across the enemy. I can also understand why they'd want a future Delibird, a Pokemon that could literally do the job of Santa Claus, delivering presents all around the world. But why would they need a future Gardevoir, Gallade, Iron Valiants? That answer is in Gardevoir's Pokédex entry that talks about how it has the power to create a black hole for its trainer. The power of a black hole, eh? That might be really useful, especially to use against a Pokemon that is a literal black hole, Guzzlord, a Pokemon that is inspired by black holes and destroys worlds, swallowing them whole, the remains never to be seen again. The Iron Valiant being fairy fighting type is perfectly opposed to Guzzlord being dragon dark type. I believe that this Pokemon was created to go toe-to-toe with the black hole creating, or big creature, Guzzlord, to save the future for people and robot Pokemon everywhere. I don't know how to put that into anything else. There's a little theory. Hey, lots of people seem to think about Pokemon like Magnemite and Voltorb as being human-made Pokemon, which I always found a little bit odd because they were introduced in the same generation as Porygon, which is explicitly a human-created Pokemon. Of course, I understood the confusion. Voltorb looks like a Pokeball, and so too does Magnemite look like, well, a bunch of magnets and screws. It seems likely that if some Pokemon can be human-made, all Pokemon could be human-made. Or at least that's what we found out looking at the Paradox Pokemon, where we can see all Pokemon in the future, and these Pokemon are very clearly automatronic. Automatronic? Automatona? Sorry, Toby.exe stopped working, but we've since established that for sure Voltorb is not a human-made Pokemon. It's actually the Apricorns, and the Hisuian version came first. So very, very cool. But what about Magnemite? I've long since argued for Magnemite's existence not as a human-created Pokemon, but instead as an extraterrestrial Pokemon. And with the Paradox Pokemon, not of the future, but of the past, we can see this super clearly. Magnemite, or rather Magneton, got a new kind of variation, a past Paradox form called Sandy Shocks. It actually has legs in this version, where it's using its magnets as legs to walk around on the Earth's surface. But we've known that Magnemite existed in the ancient past as well, because we see depictions of Magnemite in the ancient past of the Pokemon world 3,000 years ago in the war against, well, whoever AZ was fighting in Kalos. On top of that, there is this really cool old school Pokemon binder that depicts Magnemites in the old ruin of Alph, but we don't actually know if this is canon or legit. The point is, Pokemon like Magnemite have thought to have been around for a long, long while, and when we look to its counterpart in Hoenn, Beldum, you can sort of see why. Beldum is also an extraterrestrial Pokemon. It appears in areas where you find Pokemon like Clefairy and Lunatone and Solrock, all space-themed Pokemon. That's like in the Great Chasm, for example. Kyurem, who lives there, is also said to come from space. Or in the Alola region, you can find Beldum on the same mountaintops where you find the likes of Minior. Beldum is a machine-like steel Pokemon, just like Magnemite, with one eye, that when it evolves is multiple versions of itself coming together, and then of course in its final form they look like flying saucers, with Magnezone and Metagross both having this kind of flying sorcery type look and flying around. Magnezone's got Pokédex entries talking about how it's often mistaken for being a UFO, and they have an absolute obsession, of course, with electromagnetism. And while Beldum can be usually found around areas where the meteorites crash, the likes of Magnemite are usually found around power plants, drawn in by the electromagnetism of these areas. Interesting to note, though, that some of the other Paradox Pokemon that live alongside Sandy Shocks, like, for example, the new Jigglypuff. Jigglypuff is also a Pokemon with a deep connection to space. And in fact, even the past Paradox Pokemon Salamence is from Meteor Falls, of all places, in the Hoenn region. That's the main place that you catch a Bagon. I do wonder if there could be some connection there. But it's more than all of that as well, because I think with these ancient Pokemon that may, according to Jigglypuff's Pokédex entries, Screamtail's Pokédex entries depict them being versions of that Pokemon from 1 billion years ago. I'm not so sure. What we do know is that these Pokemon, if they are from space and from the ancient past, might show a glimpse as well of the origins of Ultra Beasts. And that is because, I don't know if you've noticed, but the weird biology, the spiky metal edges of Sandy Shocks, and being drawn to electricity and the goofy way it walks, reminds me an awful lot of circuitry. And while there's not a lot of Pokédex connections there is only the visual look. There is this idea that the universe and time are all connected, and if you travel far enough forward or far enough back, you may find yourself in another universe, in another space. Perhaps in an ultra space. Can Pokemon live forever? Certainly Arceus can, but can your regular, everyday Pokemon live beyond a natural lifespan? I believe so. Recently, we've seen the reveal of Terapagos, a Pokemon that reminds me just a little bit too much of Wartortle, a Pokemon that is said to live for 10,000 years. Possibly the idea of a blue tortoise with extra fluffy bits around it is being mistaken for this ancient Pokemon that may be an entire region. See my video on that. But I'm not talking about a legendary Pokemon or a deity, no, I'm just talking about a regular Pokemon that you can find in the Paldea region. I'm talking about Rellor. Number 953, Rellor is the rolling Pokemon, and of course it is a dung beetle or scarab beetle. Of course, your regular trainers of Paldea can find it in the Asado Desert, and it seems to be just a brand new bug Pokemon with nothing too interesting going on. According to the Pokedex, it creates its own mud ball by mixing sand and dirt with psychic energy. It treasures this mud ball more than its own life. That right there is really interesting to me. Why treasure a ball of mud more than its own life? Well, the answer might lie in its evolution, Rabska. After walking with this Pokemon with the Let's Go feature 1,000 steps, it's built up enough dirt to evolve. Yes, that's dirt, not dung, although I suppose the Pokemon do their business out in the wild, I guess? Maybe it is still a dung beetle. Anyway, after evolution, the Pokedex has some interesting things to say. The body that supports this ball barely moves. Therefore, it is thought that the true body of this Pokemon is actually inside the ball. Now, that's the Scarlet entry, but the Violet entry is a little different. An infant sleeps inside the ball. Rabska rolls the ball soothingly with its legs to ensure the infant sleeps comfortably. So it's inside the ball, but also it's an infant in there? What gives? I think to find the answer, we need to look at what's changed since evolution. By mixing sand and dirt with psychic energy, it seems to have gained the psychic typing. And additionally, the Pokedex has gone from referring to the ball as the thing it needs to protect to potentially it being the body of the Pokemon. While you can't see much in the Ken Sugimori art, if you look at the 3D model, you can see what seems to be the pupa stage of this Pokemon, some baby version, perhaps an infant version of this Pokemon, inside the orb. Now, if you're like me and you're looking at this model and you're going, I can't see any baby pupa larva stage of this Pokemon, it's one of Pokemon's best kept secrets, because it is right there in plain sight. You just have to move the camera to a specific angle, and suddenly the light pierces through the hollow ball and you can see what appears to be the baby or pupa of this Pokemon. In fact, on the Pokedex page, the image showing Rabska shows its eyes lit up, and inside the ball, the pupa stage lit up as if it's undergoing evolution or a hatching like a Pokemon egg. But the key thing is that this Pokemon actually gains a signature move. It's one of two Pokemon that knows this move, the other being Pawmore, and that is Revival Blessing, a move that can revive another Pokemon. Now you might think what's happening here is that this is mimicking real scarab beetles that lay their own eggs inside the dung of the ball that they roll, but these Pokemon breed like any other Pokemon and reproduce through Pokemon eggs. So this isn't reproduction that's happening here. This is this Pokemon's life cycle. This Pokemon starts as a pupa stage inside one of the orbs of a Rabska. As it evolves, it starts rolling a ball of dirt and psychic energy, building up over 1,000 steps across the desert. Then it uses that psychic energy to transfer its consciousness into the orb. It evolves into Rabska, but the beetle that is at the helm is no beetle, it's barely a body anymore. Soon that body will die when it uses Revival Blessing and bring back the pupa into a Rellor, and it continues forever. This type of immortality isn't even like fantasy. In the real world, there are Hydra and jellyfish that are known as the immortal jellyfish because they live, well, forever unless eaten. And they do so by reverting their cells back to an earlier stage of their life cycle. That is what is happening here. There's a little bit more, and a second theory here that ties into this Pokemon. And by the way, these I came up with Lumia's post when we were coming up with just 5 mini theories for Paldea. I recommend you check out that video. I think it's brilliant. But Rellor as well, in its shiny form, seems to be rolling not a ball of sand and psychic energy, but instead a nugget. Yes, this golden ball. I actually happened to catch a shiny Rellor just out in the wild, and when I first saw it, I thought, well, that's cool. If it's holding a nugget, they make it look like that. But then it turns out that no, this was in fact the shiny version of the Pokemon. But there's no denying what that orb looks like. That is a nugget for sure, a valuable item in the world of Pokemon worth many Poké-dollars. This is something we've seen before in Meowth, for example, who can use the move Payday, and the coin on its head generates more smaller coins that people use as cash in the Pokemon world. So is this where all nuggets come from? I think that's totally possible. You might think, but hang on, shiny Pokemon are really rare, and there's a lot of nuggets in the world of Pokemon. But if you look at the comparable size of population from these kinds of Pokemon to real-world beetles, you can learn a lot. When Googling how many insects and beetles there are in the world, which, by the way, side note, I just found it fascinating that when I Googled beetles, it turns out that their scientific name, or rather the order that they come from, is called Coleopatra? Oh, the dyslexia is hitting. I just think it's really weird that they didn't make a Cleopatra joke, given that like it's ancient Egypt and scarabs, and I'm just sure there's like a joke in there somewhere. While your odds of finding a shiny Rellor are 1 in 4,096, there are quintillions, that's multiple quintillions, that's one with 18 zeros of individual beetles in the world. The numbers actually vary depending on the source I was looking at. Some said quintillions, some said quadrillions. It's a lot. It was also hard to find a right number because every time I typed in how many beetles are alive in the world, it referred to me to the band, the Beatles. The point is, no matter the case, no matter the number, there is more than enough to provide for plenty of these nuggets as a natural resource in the Pokemon world that is rare and thus makes it valuable. But here's the interesting thing. That means for every nugget in your bag in a game of Pokemon, there's a Relor out there that just stopped being shiny and instead had to start rolling a new ball of dirt and psychic energy. Perhaps the goal even of the immortal life cycle of this Pokemon is in fact to roll itself eventually into a shiny form. If it goes through its life cycle at least 4,096 times, at least one of those it'll end up being a shiny. This is just a silly little Pokemon theory. I'm working on some hardcore theories actually about The Legend of Zelda right now, so check out my Zelda channel for that. Thank you for all the support on me launching that. It's been amazing to see the support there.